Good morning. Welcome to the Insurance and Real Estate Committee's public hearing for Tuesday, February 28th. My name is Carrie Wood. I'm the state representative from Rocky Hill and co-chair of this wonderful committee. Any comments from our co-chairs or ranking? Is Senator Cabrera on?
Good morning, Representative Wood. I hope everyone is doing well with the weather and staying safe, and looking forward to a good hearing. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you. Representative Pavlik-Tomato? Senator Wong? Okay, with that, we will get started. Number one on the list is Tom Dunn from the town of Wolcott. Tom, are you with us today?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And co-chairs Wood and Cabrera and ranking members Pavlik and D'Amato. Thank you very much. I am Mayor Tom Dunn from the town of Wolcott, also the president of CCM, which the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities is Connecticut's statewide association of towns and cities and the voice of local government. Your partners in governing Connecticut. Our members represent 99% of Connecticut's population, and we appreciate the opportunity to testify on bills of interest to towns and the cities. I did submit testimony was given to you. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it. I will just go over a couple of parts, couple of pieces of it, and then hopefully we can get into some questions and answers. House Bill 6785 would provide much needed mandate relief to towns and cities. The proposal would relieve municipalities of the unfunded state mandate to remove and store the personal property belonging to evicted or residential tenants. Municipalities were relieved in 1997 of the mandate to remove and store the possessions of evicted commercial tenants. This is a mandate that frustrates municipal officials because there's no real reason towns should be placed into what is essentially a landlord-tenant contract issue. The mandate takes up considerable time with a little benefit on the municipal level, and CCM urges the committee to pass this common sense legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Dunn. I was wondering if you have any numbers of how much your town is paying for this unfunded mandate.
The payment's not big for a small town like ours. I did ask around other cities. I've been testifying on this for the past 20 years, this bill. It's more so really what I mentioned at the end. It's a common sense that the town is not part of this. The town is not involved in how much the people are renting from, how long they're there. And really the important part is that the towns are doing their job for the residents that move into town, that rent or are in trouble or having trouble. We have a food pantry available. We have the availability, they have fuel assistance. And anytime somebody comes to the town hall or our municipal agent, we're definitely helping the people out. But the point that we have to take at the end of it, when their belongings are taken out by the sheriffs now, the towns used to be responsible for taking those belongings out. That was relief. That was a great relief. But now I have to have staff prepared to go and meet the sheriffs at a facility, which we do a rental facility. Some use their town garages, but again, if the whole sense is keeping the property safe and all that, I don't know how much that is safe. We do the rentals. We have to get the lock, put it on there. We have to make sure, look at the list, make sure everything is in there, nothing's missing. And again, some people do come back for it, but it's been the case, on a lot of cases, the people don't even come back for it. What they leave, because they usually have enough time to remove some of their items. Some do have trouble, they help. But again, I think it's just a part where it just doesn't make sense for the towns and, well, actually the taxpayers of each town and city to be responsible for something they really had no part of. And again, it's not to say that we don't want to help people and we're not here. It's just we take on a big liability of getting that if somebody claiming something's missing. Again, we have to backtrack, and we were really no part of it. That's really the whole blunt of it. The dollar amounts varies from towns and cities. Cities are probably paying a lot of money for storage or removal after that, because if nobody comes back for it, then we got to go up. I have to get a crew to go up, take it, and throw the stuff away, which most of it is. And there was testimony last week that, there's some people that do come back for it. I'm not saying they don't. Some people do get in trouble. The whole part of this is, why would the town or the taxpayers be responsible for something, like this when they're not part of They're not part of the rental. They're not part of anything to say add on money, you know, that we're no part of it except when all those belongings become the town's liability now. And that's the whole point of this. And that's what I've been testifying for the past 20 years on this bill.
Wow, 20 years. Thank you for your testimony. Thanks for joining us on this snowy morning. Any questions from the committee? Representative Delnicki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know that you exactly told us how much it did cost your community, just to get a feel for what it is. And is there any way we could know exactly what the big cities, and I'll say, say Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, what their cost is, just to try to get this into perspective?
Yeah, again, our town is small and we didn't have a lot of evictions up till what just happened with COVID and all that. But, you know, we're somewhere around $1,000. But mostly it's the case that I have to get staff to take time to go up there. Then when they do, if they're going to try to sell because you have the opportunity to auction them off, you have to go up there on a morning after 15 days and, it's just the time and effort. The cities, you'll probably find out that a lot of them, I did testify a few years back, and somebody from another city, which I won't name, but didn't realize what it was, went back and I saw him the next time and he said they were close to $300,000 what they had for, removal in storage. So it's the dollar amount is not too bad for the town of Wilkett. I'll be the first one to say that, but it's everything else that it's the liability part of it. And it's just, I just don't know how we become part of that. And we have people up here crying to get into their thing. I want to get in the unit, and there's rules and regulations we have to follow. And we have to sit there like, we had no part of this. I mean, we didn't evict you. We didn't throw you out. We just have your belongings now that we have to follow some rules. So if they don't have the money and they can't pay us, they want to get in and get things. We're not supposed to do that. But we all have hearts, and it's like, okay, but. So I just don't believe we should, the towns and cities with all the other stuff that they go on. And again, we help everyone. Everyone is helped. They have, prior to them being evicted, we have the opportunity, we help them. It's just a part of the liability part of us having to be responsible for something that we weren't part of in the beginning.
I have to tell you, when you said $300,000, that was a real eye opener to me. 1,000 is bad enough. Not to mention what you're probably paying $250 a month when it comes to the rental of a storage unit, and that can accumulate quite quickly.
Yeah, we have, we're about right now, because it's 15 days that you have to hold it. So but it's still 100. You're right. So if you have to go to a month, or you have to extend it, or you have to get two, if you have two at the same time. And the 300,000, that was a few years back. I'm not sure if that was the removal and the storage, but I will try to get, if we can, if any towns and cities would give us the information, we'll try to reach out and find out exactly that number. And it will vary again, but I still think it's more of, I know the towns and cities have to have a special, put employees aside, the different, and to make sure they watch that. We could try to save the money by, we were talking about having a storage somewhere, but who has keys to that place? Who's walking through there? And then if, listen, somebody said it perfect. Somebody's, we may think it's garbage and it's not. Somebody really loves that little dresser that's all scratched up or broken, and then it's missing. Again, it becomes the town and the taxpayers' liability to, if it's a court, we have been taken to court. It's just, again, we have to just sit back, take a moment, and just think of, why would the towns and cities or the taxpayers be responsible for something like this? That's the way I look at it. I mean, unless if somebody could really tell me, and I've been arguing it for years, because I was part of when we had to remove it. I worked for our public works department, and we had to go in and take a lot of it. And some of it was sad situations, but it was unhealthy. We argued the point back then, but we were just workers, and now when I became mayor, I've been testifying almost every year on this to try to change it. We did finally get one representative listened at the legislative breakfast, came up here, worked on it, and got it where the towns are not responsible for removing the items from the home.
Well, I can certainly empathize with you as having been a former chief elected official in my community, former mayor. The burden it could place on your public works folks. Well, thank you for your testimony and thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Cabrera and Representative Nuccio have their hands up online.
Senator Cabrera.
Thank you, Representative. Good morning, Mayor. Good to see you again. I
Same
hope
here.
you're doing well
Yep.
on this snowy day. Just a quick question, and I know you probably don't have hard numbers, but can you give us a sense of whether this problem has gotten worse, stayed the same, or gotten better since COVID? What are you seeing in terms of the trend line and how this has impacted your town?
Our town, again, we had a few more during COVID, but right now it's just kind of steady. It's, we'll get maybe 3-4 a year. And then again, it's the point of some are easy, just go through the process, but other ones it could get, where people are up here, they want to get in there and I didn't realize I left something in there, we got to go up, which we're not supposed to open it unless they pay for it. So again, it's not bad here. I don't know. I can't speak for the other towns and cities. And again, everyone's going to have a different voice because they take it and maybe it doesn't cost them anything because they store it down at their public works garage or somewhere else that doesn't cost them anything. Again, where the liability is, if something's missing there. I really just stressing the point of, I just don't know how, if I'm a landlord and I own a rent, I'm going to take the responsibility of from the beginning. And that's how I could say, I don't know how much more I can stress that it just should not be in the hands of the taxpayers in the city. And I've seen, every incident is the same, but when you get people up here crying, they want to get their stuff, but they don't have the money. We would actually funnel up some money and try to say, okay, we'll pay for this rental, get your stuff, but you have a truck. No, we don't have a truck. But again, now we're in the middle of this. I'm the mayor of a town. I don't own the rent. I didn't sign the contract. I didn't evict them. I didn't tell them they had to leave. But now I got to be the ones who say, you can't get your belongings, or we'll help you get your belongings along. It's just, even if we did good on every single one of them, it's just not it shouldn't be in the place of the towns or the cities. And nobody else, no one's going to lose anything from this. I mean, the sheriffs, I know they testified for, I'm not against anybody, and they'll still be able, they have to do that. But it's just finding the place where to put their items, and it should not be in the hands of the taxpayers.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Mayor.
Thank you.
Madam
Same
Chair.
here. Same here, Senator.
Thank you. Representative Nuccio.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor, for coming. You bring up a very good point, and Representative Dunn asked. I know in one of my towns, one of my small towns, they had to pay several thousands of dollars for a container to even store these in, because as you said, you have to keep it someplace safe. You have to have it. You have to have it for a certain amount of time in that, and they didn't have the room in their garage or anything like that, and they used money to buy a container to keep it in. So this is an expense for the towns, and it's an expense for the taxpayers. It's an inconvenience for the employees that work there, like you said, to be kind of put in the middle of something that they're not really part of. And it's also, it should be something that's handled with the landlord or the people who own the property and such, and in the court systems, because that's the whole thing is going through them and not the town. So I appreciate you bringing this forward and bringing your voice forward as a small town, because when something seems right in one place, it doesn't necessarily make it right in another town. So this is definitely something I think we need to recognize, that it's very different, and we have the opportunity to do something about it. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Representative Denning has his hand up online.
Representative Denning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dunn, thank you for testifying. I guess I'm looking at it from another side of viewpoint, is that the most vulnerable among us who are being evicted and don't have the resources, who should represent them in this particular time and have their interests at heart to make sure that their possessions aren't locked away or accessible. And if the town is not there to help protect them in some regards, who else is to be their representative?
And that's a good question and probably a tough question, and that's probably why we're sitting here now arguing this. Again, as I spoke before, the town is always there, even there for the landlords, whether if they need help with something, and the tenants, if they're struggling with anything, we have it. We have the food pantries, we have the oil fund, we help them any way they can. But when they get to the point with the evictions, again, I don't know, trying to be compassionate here. If it's my family member or if it's me being evicted, I'm going to reach out to my family and ask them, I'm in a tough time. Can you help me? I have to move out. The landlord, I don't know if the landlord probably worked with these people, tried to help them along the line. You're right. The town sitting here as a CEO of the town to say, oh no, we don't want, we're not here to help you. We're certainly here to help you. But we're not here now. All of a sudden, we just helped you, but now we took on a full liability. We're almost now like the tenant, but we don't have any say in it. We have rules we have to follow, and people are crying up in my, come up in my office and want to go in and get their socks or their shirts because they didn't realize they left that box behind. Of course, I'm going to do that, but that's breaking the rules because you didn't pay. But who's going to help them? We're all here to help each other. But this is a whole thing of where the responsibility lies, and it's the liability. We would certainly be there. I would certainly personally be there to help somebody if they were, standing in our doorway and asking. But I'm talking about this all in perspective, the whole idea of the towns and cities, the taxpayers of the town that go out and work hard and go out and give money to the fuel fund and go out and give money and food to the food pantries to help people that are struggling. Now all of a sudden they're in the responsibility of taking the liability of stuff that actually they left behind.
And so, yes, thank you. And I appreciate it. Actually, I applaud you for your compassion. And I do believe that you put the humanity back in government when you act in that way. My real question goes to is, if not you, then who? I didn't think of that. I didn't think of that answer. Again, I know I listened to the sheriff's office, and they're right. They're saying it's working now. This is somebody's belongings. Again, a lot of it's left behind. A lot of it we end up throwing in the garbage. Some people do come back and grab some of their stuff. Who? I don't know. I don't know if that's something where if I'm the landlord, I'm going to tell the people, I'll keep your stuff for 5 days or whatever, or you have, they have enough time to know that something's going on. I don't know, again, you keep saying you're going to be having a bill on capping the leases. So you can't say, the landlord, if they could add on to the rent and say, this is going to cover, if you get evicted, this will cover us to get a truck to get your stuff somewhere. I don't know. That's not, again, it's putting the town and the taxpayers in a responsibility of we're not getting anything. We're not making anything from that. We're not getting anything from that, except we've already helped the people as long as they ask for help as much as we can. Right now, we're just saying we don't want the liability of the responsibility and liability or pay for it of something that you left behind. I appreciate your testimony, and that's all I have, Madam Chair. Thank you.
I know that wasn't the greatest answer, but it's something I never thought I might have to think another 20 years. And no, I hope not. But.
No, I applaud your compassion and your humanity in this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Dunn, for your time today. Next up, we have Brian Mezek.
Hi, good morning, Senator Cabrera and members of the Real Estate and Insurance Committee. My name is Brian Mezek. I'm a Connecticut State Marshal. I'm the president of the State Marshals Association of Connecticut, AFSCME Local 2193. State marshals are sworn public officials responsible for enforcing our court orders, including evictions, and state marshals are the most acquainted and knowledgeable about the actual eviction removal process. I personally have done, I think, over 1,000 residential move outs. So I certainly have experience, and my members do too. I'm here testifying on HB 6785, an act concerning evicted tenants' property. We put in written testimony, but I'm here again to communicate the perspective of the Connecticut State Marshals. Now, I think there's some understandable confusion about the final parts of an eviction. Not all evictions require a move out. But for those that do, we move all the tenants' possessions and personal effects. And all those items, I've heard them described in these hearings before as garbage. We don't move garbage, we move the tenants' items. We don't move things into municipalities like broken, damaged furniture, chemicals, things like that. This system has been this way for my understanding, at least 125 years in our state. The purpose is to protect the tenant's belongings and to prevent confrontations between the landlord and the tenant. Tenants who are removed under eviction orders are often the most vulnerable in our population. Just last week, I moved out someone in the town of Wallingford. I woke him up in bed. He had no idea that he was being evicted that day. It became real that morning for him, and he didn't lose his things. He was able to claim his things from the town. So part of this process and part of what the marshals do is provide evicted tenants dignity and respect, and also give the landlord the apartment back nearly immediately. And then the tenant can get back their property in a neutral location. Now, I've heard it said that this is sort of a private matter between a landlord and a tenant, but an eviction order is a court order for possession that uses the force of the government and our state marshals to enforce that order. Once the items are moved, the person has 15 days to pick them up from the town. Municipalities are currently enabled by statute to charge the cost of storage to the defendant, but in my experience and in my localities, most do not charge the tenant. And it's also important to note that most towns are not storing items in private self-storage units. Some do. In my experience, most towns are storing it in already existing municipal facilities or containers on town property. So it's unclear under the bill if this envisions shifting the storage responsibility to the state marshals. Our role is legal execution and service of process, and the towns are charged with matters of health, welfare, safety, trash, fire, police. So evictions are a judicial matter, I would say, of local importance. And I was reminded this week that towns have other areas of responsibility in judicial matters. They provide all our probate courts, lease space, copiers, electricity. So this is a similar judicial responsibility of our local towns. So if the intention is to shift coordination of storage away from the towns and cities to our state marshals, I would just highlight that we have a lot of other responsibilities for the state, including service of restraining orders, showing up to court, civil arrests, meeting with domestic violence victims at the courts. So just one final point I want to communicate this morning, that not all evicted items that are stored by towns are left unclaimed. In some cities, the rate is 30% or higher. So Connecticut's process is structured for a reason: protections for the tenants, finality for the landlord, and a smooth, safe, orderly process under which state marshals can conduct evictions. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Brian, thank you for your perspective. I think you brought up a lot of great points for us to consider. The intent of the bill was not to shift the burden to the state marshals. It was really just to have the discussion. You know, towns and cities can continue to do what they do under the bill, or they can opt out. And you're bringing up a really good point, is if they do opt out, what does that mean? You know,
Correct.
What happens? So we do need to think about that more fully in this bill. I also, could you answer if when towns, just to clarify for us, because you brought up something that I wanted to make sure the committee knew, when towns do store things, they are now liable for those things, correct? Could a tenant sue the town if their property was damaged or the items that they thought were there were missing?
Well, generally, you know, as the state marshal, we also serve legal process and court orders and lawsuits. So, you know, I'm well aware of the dynamic that anyone can sue anyone in the marketplace, but the statutes charge us, the marshals, to move the tenant's possessions and personal effects. Provided we do that and the town stores it within the time frame, I don't know what sort of claim the person would have. You know, sitting and listening to the testimony of some of the municipalities, I'm thinking, you know, perhaps they should be indemnified for that purpose. Would certainly be appropriate, but I haven't seen that too much. Sometimes people think they're missing things, but you know, the marshals assure them we move everything except the things that the town won't take in. Some towns have sort of outright refused to take mattresses, for example. We don't move mattresses, but there's nothing on the books that says we don't move mattresses. It's just effectively the towns have outright refused to take them, so we don't move them. That's certainly a little bit of a gray area that could maybe open them up to something. I've also wondered if perhaps the things that aren't moved should be listed out in some way through a regulatory process. I've wondered that in the past too, because right now it's possessions and personal effects. Provided we move their possessions and personal effects, we've done the process. But some of those things that don't get moved or effectively don't get moved should probably be listed out. But that's separate from this bill. I don't think that's what the bill
Right.
envisions.
Mayor Dunn did mention that for his town, it's a small town, so they're able to use like some of the facilities within the town for storage. But the reason why we have explored this bill is because towns are renting storage units.
Mhm.
Some towns are now looking at buying storage units that can be put on a town property to store some of these. So there's a lot of logistical things that are happening within the towns and cities to deal with this issue. And we're trying to come up with a solution that works for everyone and still, protects people's belongings. So your perspective was very helpful. Any questions from the committee?
Representative Pavlik Tomato has her hand up.
Representative Pavlik Tomato.
Thank you. I was wondering to the gentleman, you are an attorney, are you?
No, I'm a Connecticut State Marshal for New Haven County.
Where in the Constitution, you had mentioned about the courts, they provide copies, but I was wondering where in the Constitution or in the, you were talking about the services, in the Constitution and even state statute where it states that courts have to supply copies to litigants, whether they're plaintiff or defendant. Can you point out it for me?
I'm not certain of your question, Representative.
So you had mentioned about the services that courts provide different things, and I'm trying to figure out, they may do that voluntarily, but there's nothing statutorily that requires, nor is it the obligation of government to provide copies to people, to provide a lot of things that you're talking about. So I'm trying to determine where in statute that these things are required. That some of the other things that you mentioned, because you were using that justification as to why we should continue this statute and we should require storage of, the government should require storage of a tenant's personal property.
Okay, I think maybe perhaps you were referring to my testimony. I was trying to make the point that towns have other judicial obligations that they provide to the state, such as providing space for our probate courts. So similarly, towns provide a judicial function in providing storage for evicted tenants. And the purpose of the towns providing storage for evicted tenants is a neutral place for tenants to reclaim their items. And many do. The court order of possession out of our housing courts is a judgment of possession. It's not a judgment for the tenant to lose all their possessions and personal effects. So that was my only point in my testimony. It wasn't regarding copies. It was regarding other judicial functions that our towns and municipalities provide.
Right, but not required to provide. The problem here, you're talking about, so I understand now your point about being a neutral place, but when the problem is I'm confused as to why there has to be a neutral place when this is a private contract between private individuals. Now, you make money off of when you have to move items from a tenant's or a landlord's actually property to storage, don't you?
Well, the state marshal system is set up that we're compensated on a fee for service basis. We're state officials and sworn officials, but we don't derive a state salary. So the fees.
That wasn't the question. The question was, do you make money off of moving things from the location to storage?
Generally, it's not a profit center for the state marshals. We're tied up for the whole morning to move it out. Honestly, it's a function that we provide, and it's a function we're required to provide for the courts in legal execution. So we are compensated for our time while we're there, but not highly.
Okay, but that's a yes. So from what you're saying, then would you be willing to provide this for free? Because I'm looking for a free marshal to do this. So I would be happy to, because you seem to think that it is done out of the goodness of your heart, which I appreciate and I like. But if I could have your contact information, if you're willing to provide it for free, I could use that and be able to give it to some of my landlords.
I'd be happy to help any member of the public with my statutory obligations.
Okay, for free.
Representative, the General Assembly's passed laws that set our fees. We can't charge more than them. We can't charge less than them.
Well, I think the point of this bill, though, is that the towns and the taxpayers, okay, the taxpayer, we're paying for this, a private contract between a landlord and a tenant. The tenant doesn't pay, and, you know, I feel bad for the tenant. I feel bad for me in situations. Everybody has issues at different times. And, you know, it could be different private groups. I think there was a representative here who felt bad, and I would be happy to give him some names of tenants who would like their stuff stored if he wants to pay for it, or if anybody else wants to. But I don't see why I have to pay for it. I'm not offering to pay for it. I have my own things to pay for. And as a taxpayer, as a town, it's not our obligation. It's not the function and the role of government to be involved in private contracts to pay for other people's things to be stored. Not even immediate food and shelter, which we already pay for, but we're talking about storing their items, which to me, I can't wrap my head around why I'm paying to store somebody's iPhone and their couch and their clothes. It's actually completely baffling to me that this is actually considered a necessity. You know, there's churches, there's plenty of organizations. Like I said, people here seem to be willing to volunteer my money, but not their own money. And that's where I'm getting really frustrated with this whole process. So thank you, Madam Chair. That's all.
Representative Delnicki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to be clear here, the State Marshal's position is that you do not want to see this changed. You want it to remain in statute the way it is. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And just to go one step further, when you are given that court order, you have to move the contents out. Do you take an inventory just to protect both the person that's having their goods moved out and to protect the state marshals?
We do. The movers that we use keep an inventory, and the towns provide the inventory. We're provided the inventory, which is ultimately provided to the landlord. That way there's documentation on all parts. And it's important to point out that the landlords are getting the apartment back nearly immediately. They can relet it probably the next day. So there's a finality to the process. Sometimes I don't know how long it's going to take or what's even inside, if the tenant's going to be here. There's many different variables. I stopped predicting many years ago how evictions would go. There's some that I would think, well, this is going to be really simple, and it turns into a really complicated emotional matter. And there's ones that I think are going to be very difficult. And I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning thinking, how is this going to go? And it becomes very simple. So I can't really generalize town to town. They're all different. They're very uniquely personal. But yes, we do make an inventory, and all those items are boxed up and turned over to the town so they can pick them up.
Well, I appreciate your testimony, and it's interesting to see this is like a conundrum, like a hot potato,
Sure.
for lack of a better way of expressing it, where the cities and towns have a financial burden. The marshals have a job to do, a difficult one, I might add, from listening to your commentary there. And the question then becomes, how do we solve the problem? And thank you for coming forward with your testimony. It was enlightening to see your perspective and the marshal's perspective. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Brian, thank you for spending time with us on this snowy morning, and your testimony was very
Thank
helpful. Next up, we have Melissa Hicks. Next up, we have Raphael Podolsky.
Thank you very much. I'm Raphael Podolsky. I'm a lawyer with the legal aid programs. I work for Connecticut Legal Services, and I represent the 3 major legal aid programs. We a large part of what we do in the housing areas, we defend evictions, we defend tenants and evictions. There are 3 bills that I've submitted testimony on. Let me just mention them briefly. House Bill number 6784 is the bill on non-compliant landlords. We support that bill. It brings Attorney General involvement into the case where there's a very large landlord with persistent non-compliance with municipalities, with municipal orders. And it gives it establishes a receivership procedure by which enforcement can be accomplished. The second bill is House Bill number 6785, which is the one you've heard about with tenant possessions. We believe that no action should be taken on this bill, so as to say we are against doing the bill. The bill itself does nothing more really than just moving some costs around. But I think it's really important that you understand what we're talking about here. And I think the Marshal has helped present that to you. First of all, the Housing Committee is already doing a bill on this. It's had a long hearing. It's had a lot of witnesses. It's working through whether it's going to propose any changes or not. I hope it's not going to propose changes, but I think that you should be leaving it to the Housing Committee. The second thing is there was what I'm calling a grand compromise that was made in 2010 that involved, as a result of a legislative work group that brought in all the stakeholders, the landlords, the tenants, the municipalities, CCM was involved, the marshals, everybody was in on that. And the result was some changes were made, and sort of the notion was that was going to settle this matter. Nobody really wanted to have any responsibility for anything. And there were some adjustments in who was responsible for what. Municipalities used to have to pick the goods up, so they weren't going to be sitting on the street and store them. That the job of picking them up was transferred to the marshals and the landlords. The properties moved by someone else to the city. The city simply stores and becomes the neutral place for redemption. Mainly what I want to say to you is Mayor Dunn said, well, what are we doing in this? Why are towns doing this? Well, the first thing you should know is we trace the statute back to 1895, not 1995, 1895. For over 100 years, this is a responsibility of municipalities. Why would the municipalities be responsible? They're responsible because this is a situation that involves their town residents who allows themselves to have their physical eviction remove them. It's roughly in about 15% of evictions that it gets to the point where somebody is still there and the marshal has to remove them and their possessions. That is typically because those people have no place to go, no vehicle to move them with, no family that's going to cover for them.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your 3 minutes are up. Please summarize.
Okay. The towns have a job. Rental property is a highly regulated municipal industry. Yes, it's by contract, but municipalities are involved in code enforcement. They're involved in all sorts of things. I will just say I've submitted testimony on Senate Bill 1113 on fair rent commissions. I'd be happy to answer questions for you. I think it's really important you understand why we have preserved this mechanism for dealing with this situation for decades and decades. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity
Great.
to testify.
Thank you for your testimony and being here in person. I was wondering if we could go back to, or if I can, you didn't really talk about fair rent commissions, but I wanted to ask you what your experience has been like. Have you helped any tenants use fair rent commissions, and how have they been functioning? Do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, my experience goes way back because I used to be a member of the Hartford Fair Rent Commission in the 1980s. So for about 4 years. So I'm very aware of what they do. And I've also, as a result of the passage of last year's bill, a couple of us have offered ourselves to municipalities as kind of trainers. And we've done 2 recent workshops, one with the town attorneys, the Connecticut Association of Municipal Attorneys, and one more general for municipal officials, because there are about 25 towns that did not formally have fair rent commissions they're supposed to have them in place by July 1st. Fair rent commissions, I think, are really important in lots of different ways. They really provide a vehicle by which landlord-tenant disputes that are typically triggered by rent increases can be resolved. Sometimes they have to make decisions, but a lot of the time, those disagreements, the existence of a third-party person, typically a staff person at the town, getting the two parties to talk to each other resolves a lot of the cases. And one of the things we've learned is that even though people assume that fair rent commissions are going to be like the landlord members against the tenant members, a large percentage of fair rent commission decisions are unanimous. And what a fair rent commission does is it really applies an individualized sort of an equity standard of unconscionableness. And it turns out people's concepts of what's conscionable and unconscionable, guided by the statutory standards, turn out to be relatively similar. So you do get some split decisions. You get mostly an agreement. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, so you should focus me a little more.
No, it's good. I did want to follow up on that. I've gotten some feedback that some of the larger landlords are really good at dragging the process out. You're right. The fair rent commissions are supposed to get, two people together to discuss an issue that's happening with a tenant, and that there's sometimes meetings scheduled and then they don't show up, or just have you experienced that going on, or are you experiencing the commissions functioning well?
Well, first of all, in recent years, I'm not in front of commissions, so I don't have direct experience. I talk to people who've been to commissions. My experience is that by and large, they're functioning well. I don't think that there's sometimes are just the kind of delays you have in a process where just meetings are not held the next day or something of that sort. I don't have a sense of either tenants or landlords making efforts to drag things out. I think from both perspectives, it's in their interest to get cases resolved, not in their interest to drag them out. So I'm not saying it can't happen or there can't be complexities that would extend a proceeding, but by and large, commissions make their decisions in one hearing. Usually they'll hold a hearing, they'll take testimony from landlords and tenants, their administrative agency of the municipality. And before they go home, they will move from the sort of the hearing part of the session into the decision-making part of the session, and they will decide. And so the decision will happen the same day as the hearing. I think that's the usual case. Sometimes you have more complicated cases or you have more tenants involved, but those are atypical. Those are not typical. They're very important. One of the issues, the bill goes to the issue of expansion of commissions, and last year's bill was very important because it really moved. It's going to result in the doubling of the number of commissions. There were about 25. Before they're going to be close to 50 by the end of the year, and there's a recognition that the commission requires some extra involvement by the town. And one of the things I suggest in my testimony, which may or may not apply to this bill in particular, but there are ways that smaller towns can combine. For example, the statute allows for regional commissions. It would be possible for there's several other possibilities if this bill does not go through that the towns could be looking at. And I think over the long term, part of what you want is you want everybody to have access to a commission somewhere. And that's really the difficulty as the towns get smaller, then it becomes a little harder for them to create another board. But you want to make sure tenants don't have the right to challenge a rent increase in general, unless they're in a town that has a commission. So if there's no commission, the tenants have no place to go. There's nobody who has the authority to make the decision. So they're faced with either move, which can be very difficult in a lot of circumstances, or pay. In theory, it's a negotiated contract, but if a tenant's already there, they really, if they can't work out a contract, they're going to have to go. And that's a huge change for a tenant. I'm not talking about an eviction even, just the fact that they have to move when they don't want to move. We've seen cases where people have been, somebody from a new buyer comes in, buys the building, immediately starts jacking up the rents. And you've got seniors who've been there for 20, 25 years. And all of a sudden the rent goes up from $1,200 to $1,800. And they're not in premises where they have a right to challenge that. And they can be told, pay or move. In a fair rent commission town, you could file a complaint and say that this is a harsh and unconscionable rent increase. That's basically the standard, harsh and unconscionable.
Great. Going back to an act concerning non-compliant landlords, we have received a lot of positive outreach from this bill. It is really meant to help kind of streamline the process a little bit because, and this is affecting such a small number of owners. These are really the ones that are just letting buildings kind of crumble around them and they're doing nothing. We've heard of the black mold issues and elevators not working and just health and safety issues that are just common, and daily with these towns. Do you think this would help streamline the process for these towns a little bit better?
Absolutely. What it does is it creates a process that essentially encourages the Attorney General to take action. And first of all, in and of itself, that helps the towns to have a state agency with expertise take over the kind of the overall review of the action. Towns conceivably could do this themselves under the existing statute, but for the towns see that as more burdensome, and so it's much less likely to happen. And because these are large landlords, there's sort of a greater risk of more extended litigation. I mean, the bill applies only to complexes of 500 or more units. So you're talking about big places, not small places. So yeah, I think it's more efficient, and I think it's really more powerful from the point of view of the tenants, where you may have dozens of tenants filing complaints with the city over the condition of the premises. In theory, also, they could bring their own action, but that would mean they would really have to get organized, which is very hard to do with tenants. They would have to hire a lawyer. They're more likely at some point to just give up and move. And the result is that it's really the town's enforcement that you're looking at. In other words, these are places where municipalities have ordered landlords to make repairs. And these are large landlords that are not making the repairs. So it provides, I think, so yes, my answer to your question is yes. It provides an efficient mechanism that helps solve a problem that impacts municipalities.
Great, thank you. I think that's a lot of the feedback we've been getting is even these larger, where people are living these larger units, they're having difficulty even finding time to go to the fair rent commissions to ask the tenants to continue to do more. Has been a difficult path. So this is a solution to that.
Yeah, I should say fair rent commissions are not, they can under some circumstances deal with multiple complaints for the same building, but they're really that's not the design of the commissions. And so where you have here many complaints about the same landlord, I think this bill, it will significantly help everyone's efficiency in dealing with the issue and in resolving it and in getting the situation corrected. So I think the bill makes sense.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee?
Yes, there are 4 hands up online. We have Representative Denning, Representative Meskers, Senator Huang, and Representative Pavlak-Tomato.
Senator Wong.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome, Rafi. You cite the long history dating back to the 1800s in regards to the obligation that's always been placed on landlords to and towns to address this issue. But let's fast forward. 2023, there's significant changes in the landlord and tenant dynamic. I appreciate your support of this bill, but I think there is just a statutory review
in regards to the burden and the shift that's being placed on landlords and on towns that has not reflected the change in the dynamic of the relationship. Can you kind of talk a little bit about kind of recognizing that, or are you saying that the principle that existed in the 1800s still stands in 2023?
Okay. First, I need to clarify something because I saw when I looked online that my testimony was posted saying that I was supporting the bill. I thought I clicked the box for opposing the bill. So if there's any doubt, and I think if you look at the written testimony, that's clear. So I just want to say this is not a bill I support. I think that we should leave things alone, and that means I would not do. I'm not in favor of doing the bill. In terms of the dynamics of change, it's kind of an interesting question, but I think, and I can't tell you exactly what things were like in 1895, but I think that the situation is fundamentally the same. One of the things about the eviction process that I think the witness from the marshals pointed out is it is completely a buffered process that keeps landlords and tenants from direct conflict with each other. And that's one of the reasons municipalities have a role. In other words, if you think about it, the court papers first of all, it goes through the court system. We go back decades, centuries. Connecticut does not allow self-help eviction. Landlords cannot come in and lock people out. And I think that's true everywhere in the country. So it's not an unusual provision in Connecticut. You have to go through the courts because there's going to be violence if landlords start going to people's property and trying to throw their stuff out. So even though it's a private contract, it is not enforceable by self-help. So marshals basically serve the papers. You then have to go through the court system, which means that judges are making decisions about the process. If a decision is made by the judge that the tenant is going to be evicted, it is the marshals that serve the paper that serve now the eviction process. So that it's, and if an actual eviction occurs, a physical eviction, the municipality is there to protect the property and be the neutral entity through which the tenant can get their property back. There is no place in the system, in that process, where the landlord and the tenant are directly going face to face. And ultimately, that is because municipal responsibility is part of the health and safety responsibilities, part of the police power of municipalities to maintain a safe environment for what's potentially a dangerous process. And that's why it's buffered. That hasn't changed for 200 years. And I think that remains true. You do not want an unbuffered process. So the question then becomes, what's the best way to buffer it? And how do you work that out? And how do you decide what's the fairest balance? If it were my decision, I would get back to the fact that the municipality would pick the property up and move it to the town. Evictions used to be scheduled with the municipality. They're still scheduled with municipalities. That as part of that grand bargain 12, 13 years ago, that part was moved from the municipality to the marshal. But it doesn't change the situation. The tenant is not going to get the property back if they have to go to the landlord to get the property back. It'll happen occasionally, but a lot of times the landlord will, regardless of what the statute says, the landlord will throw the property away.
Rafi, I appreciate you clarifying because I was a little confused earlier on your last statement. So you are not in support of this bill. So
I'm not in support.
I'm glad that we got that on the record. I was a little confused.
Okay.
But it's interesting. You say that the statute dating back 200 years, 1800s, are fundamentally the same. And I must say to you, I've got to disagree with you on that because the reality is the landscape has significantly changed. Maybe I wasn't there either, but nevertheless, I think there might have been an uneven balance between landlord and tenant, and there was some protections afforded. But I've got to believe in regards to current changes in the law, that balance has been tipped and equaled out. Maybe the landlord in some cases feels like the balance has gone the other way. But what this bill is looking at is the burden, the increased burden on our municipalities. And I know the important role they have on that, but Rafi, to say the law hasn't changed and not realizing and respecting the changing and dynamic, you're pretty much tipping the balance against landlords and placing the burden on municipalities. So we always talk about evolution of law. Why wouldn't we support taking a look at this rather than keeping the status quo from 1800s? I'm just kind of, you've been a champion advocate for changes in laws relating to helping an assortment of societal historical ills, but you seem to be stuck and keen on keeping this in the 1800s. I just see the inconsistencies in that. Maybe I want to give you an opportunity to kind of articulate your response to that.
I certainly don't believe as a general proposition that nothing should ever change. So I don't want to suggest that somehow I'm a traditionalist to the point that everything's got to stay the same. What I'm saying, though, is that this aspect of the process, I mean, this piece of it, we're only talking about the very last stages of an eviction. That this process, this is trying to balance what is supposed to happen at the end of an eviction. This is the best and fairest way to do it, and that we have not devised a better and more effective way. An eviction, as the marshal pointed out, means the tenant loses the use of the apartment. They are evicted from the apartment. They are not supposed to be impoverished. And for tenants who do not physically remove themselves prior to the time the marshal comes, these are the people who either have no resources to physically move or don't understand the process. Or there was testimony at the housing committee of someone who was in the hospital during the entire period of the eviction, was unaware of it. In the absence of some neutral entity holding the property, there was no way to get it back. The marshals have talked about whole houses that had to be moved, where people would lose literally every piece of property they owned if there was not some neutral structure. That issue about how you deal at the very end of an eviction with people who have not been able, for whatever reason, to move out prior to the marshal coming to put them out is a problem that has existed from the very beginning. And in looking at what happens now, we see that while most tenants are gone, most of the time this is not an issue in an eviction. It does happen sometimes. And tenants are resident of the town, and towns regulate landlord-tenant matters extensively. If you had an illegal lockout, who is going to be called? The town is going to be called. The police officer is going to come out to address the issue and may even make an arrest. Who tells the landlord that they have to comply with the housing code? It's the municipality. The municipality playing a role in this process, the landlord-tenant process, is absolutely normal. I think it's a legitimate question to ask. Has something changed in a way that we should have a different solution to this problem? But the solution, I think, has to be one in which there is a neutral entity that is controlling the situation. And this seems to work as well as any. The burden on municipalities, I mean, the question was raised, well, why should the taxpayers pay for this? Well, why should the taxpayers pay for code enforcement? That's an argument against why should the attorney general, as a public official, step in to make sure that a large landlord isn't essentially letting a building deteriorate to everybody's disadvantage. We do see a role for government in protecting certain things. In a place like West Hartford, I don't know if this is still true, but it certainly used to be, when the town was notified the tenant was going to be evicted, they sent a person out from their social services department to try and see if they could get an arrangement by which the physical eviction would not have to take place. Maybe the town would help the tenant move out. Towns don't do that, and that's not required by law in Connecticut. But it was a recognition that you're looking at what the consequences are if in that town, the town residents are put out on the street with no place to go. Is that what they want? It's not in the interest of the town. It's in the interest of the town to do something to try to avoid that from happening. And I think some towns do, some towns don't.
Rafi, thank you. And you bring up the complexity that you have a tenant-landlord dynamic, but in the case of this, where municipal governments get involved. something has to change. And I think we're going to get to an additional crisis mode in upcoming months because of the rise of evictions that resulted from the moratorium on evictions, COVID, economic challenges. And I want to applaud the leadership of this committee for raising this issue, because it's a conundrum, but it's an issue that we need to start approaching and maybe using a fresh set of eyes. And I think ultimately, I think a statutory regulation dating back to 1800s that you pointed out needs to be evolved. And I do believe the interplay is complex, but with the increase in that role, you're looking at significant unfunded mandates to municipalities. So, this is why we're having this public hearing, because something needs to be done, and an evolution in this process needs to occur. And I always appreciate your input on that. And I hope you'll continue to be able to offer your insights. So thank you for the time and the indulgence, Madam Chair, and look forward to hearing more about this issue.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Pavlock D'Amato.
Is there someone else who can go before me, or did everyone else go?
We have a bunch of people. Do you want to go last?
Out of all the reps that want to speak, I'll just go after. But
Okay.
yeah, if there's somebody else.
Denning, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for testifying to this issue, and thank you for bringing up the historical aspect of municipalities having to be responsible for this exchange. One of the issues I have with this bill is that when people who are citizens of that particular town or community and expect their property to be protected, and just as everybody else's property is protected, when they are when they're the most vulnerable and the least able to manage it financially, the town is coming in and saying, we no longer want to be responsible because it's no longer held in a particular dwelling. And while I appreciate the hardship that bears, I have never heard of any particular town or municipality that has caused them to either shut down their schools or provide other services. And I'm not sure this is a real problem for most municipalities. And if it is, then maybe the state should bear the cost. I would just propose that we keep this bill as it is. And sir, if there has been any other way that you're aware of that other municipalities in other states or towns have dealt with this, are you aware of any other way that's been more effective?
I guess the answer is no. There was a point at which in Massachusetts, a tenant was allowed to direct the marshal who was removing property to move it to a specific location that the tenant chose. And I think in some cases that allowed the tenant to have the property moved to a place where the tenant wouldn't be charged. And these would be tenants that really had no money. But I think Massachusetts itself repealed that after 1 or 2 years. So that's not something that I'm aware of that continues to exist. And I mean, I have been involved in discussions on this for many years with towns and marshals and landlord groups. And I don't think we've not been able to come up with something that all agree is a preferable way to do it. I know there may be other suggestions out there, but at least at this point in time, I don't think anybody has come up with something that really works. Again, you have to recognize that these are situations where households are in pretty desperate straits. And it also applies in foreclosures, and people who've lost their houses to foreclosure, and they end up, if they can't find a place to move to, and if they don't have money to get to rent an apartment, they end up in the same situation where the bank now needs to be putting them out. So you can sometimes be talking about a lot of property, and you really want to be cautious about saying, well, it's too bad they couldn't get out, so they forfeit their property. I mean, that has huge consequences for residents of the town. And there are reasons why you would want a policy that tries to protect in that situation.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Meskers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay? I've got earphones. I'm not sure the microphone's working well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. I want to thank you for your testimony. I think I'm trying to frame out the argument in the conversation and the pluses and minuses of the legislation we're looking at today. You know, at some level, the dynamics changing between tenants and landlords. And certainly we're seeing a lot of investment coming into the state from new players buying up properties. Now, in and of itself, a new player might be sprucing up the properties and maybe just moving up the rents and doing nothing, but making a financial investment. Ultimately, what we're all looking for is investments in new properties, investments in expanding our housing stock, new residents of growth in the state. But I guess what I'd like to hear from you is, you know, the thoughts on the social consequences that we're looking at here. And if the law is fairly balanced. I'm concerned, you know, if people are being evicted at a certain net worth or certain asset standards that they have, and who's bearing the cost. And I'm sure it's a small percentage. I would expect that the majority of the people are at limited financial means, and the assets, if they lose the assets, it may be falling to the municipality or the nonprofits in that municipality to try to find assisted living housing, find housing, and restore property that has been disposed of. And I'd like, you know, your comments and thoughts, what your experience has been in the ratio of, you know, their landlord-tenant disputes or their foreclosures with people, you know, have, for whatever reasons, they have means and they've been foreclosed on. And I guess that's the question: are we striking the fair balance, or are there hurdles that we should be looking at there financially? So comment first on what you're seeing on maybe on the investment profile, what's going on, and how you think the legislation deals with the issue of, you know, whether you think the legislation is impactful or dangerous for everyone. Because I know you're opposed to it, so I want to hear your view there. I want to get a better understanding.
Okay, I'm not sure that I understand the question, so let me try and answer, but it's possible I'm not really answering your question. I think I said that a number of years ago, we actually did a survey by calling public works departments to try and get a sense of how many cases we were talking about. And that's, at least from our end, where the 15% figure came from, which is, if you compare, at the time at least, if you compared the number of eviction actions that were brought in court with the number of, this was the days when the municipality actually picked the property up at the curb. The number of times they made pickups at the curb, it turned out it was around something like between 13 and 15% on average of the cases. So that's what leads us to that number. Our experiences lead us to have some sense of what kind of circumstances would a tenant still be there. As if you came to legal aid and it was clear that the tenant was going to lose an eviction, was going to have to move, we would tell the tenant, do not wait until the marshal comes. They're going to box up your stuff. It's going to be put somewhere where you never know for sure whether you're going to see it again. If you're not there, it may get thrown out. You need to get those things out. There's some things they don't pick up, as was pointed out by the marshal. We're never going to say, stay there and wait for them to come. This is not a moving service. The marshals have a job to do. And so the people who are left there are people who have very few alternatives. And of course, we represent a tiny percentage of the people who are being evicted. I mean, if you have a lawyer, the odds of your actually having a physical move out are going to be much lower, precisely because if we're going to lose the case, we're going to tell people they got to get out themselves. So you have people who don't understand the process, don't realize what's going on. I don't want to be repetitious of what I said earlier in the hearing. So when you're weighing the consequences as to how you balance these things out, part of what weighs from the point of view of the tenant and from how we deal with tenants in this situation is that there are not a lot of other alternatives. I mean, they may not have any way to physically move the property. I mean, this could be somebody who's a senior who doesn't have a car, doesn't drive, has no capacity to pick things up and move them, and doesn't have a family that's going to come and help them out. I mean, you don't want them to lose their photograph album. I mean, it's things like this, and that ultimately the burden on towns is very, very small in terms of budget. Most of the town, and I'm not saying it's a zero amount, but it's even for large cities. I understand that the municipalities can be annoyed by doing this, but you've got to weigh it against what the consequences are. I understood your question as being, how do you weigh, what are these consequences and how do you weigh them and how do you balance them? And I think those are really good questions, and they're legitimate questions for the legislature to ask. But this is circumstances we're dealing with here. Many of these cases involve people who defaulted. They did nothing to slow the eviction down. They may never have responded to the papers because they didn't understand what the papers were about. And there are plenty of people, I mean, we see that in evictions all the time, that people don't know that these papers mean something. It's not just junk mail that you're getting court papers. And I understand you can say, well, it's their own fault. If they didn't respond to court papers, they didn't file an appearance, they didn't do what they were supposed to do to defend. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that they're ready to get moved out. I mean, we have certainly had experiences where someone comes to us to say the marshal came yesterday to say he was coming tomorrow morning to put me out. I have no idea what he's talking about. I didn't know there was an eviction. Well, I'm sure that person got some papers at some point. They didn't know, but they didn't. It didn't get properly absorbed. Does that mean they should lose all of their property? No, that's not what it means. It means they're going to get put out. But that's why we have these kind of sort of emergency safeguards at the last second.
Thank you. You've I don't know if you answered the question I asked, but you answered a question that helps frame my decision making. So I really appreciate that. I mean, part of the public hearing process and getting people like yourselves to testify is to get your experience on the table for all of us who may have not been in this situation. And that's very helpful. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Delnicki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Attorney Podolsky, for being here. You made comment earlier pertaining to the Fair Rent Commissions and training. Were you offering up the ability or the opportunity for a community to actually get training?
Yes.
Because
we've done that. As a result of this last year's bill, which was bringing in around 25 new towns, and we knew that a lot of those towns had no real knowledge. Working with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, we developed what we called a toolkit, a model ordinance, because you need an ordinance in order to have a fair rent commission, an extensive kind of FAQ for frequently asked questions. And we said that we would be willing to meet with people. And so it's resulted in 2 workshops. We'll probably do another workshop for municipal officials. We've been asked, we offered ourselves if any towns that already have commissions wanted us to come and talk about it. We're happy to do it. We've done it most recently for Bloomfield, which has had a fair rent commission for many years. But a number of those commissions were kind of dormant or semi-dormant in recent years because rents weren't rising. So they weren't getting very many complaints. And I think we would do it. And we're free. I mean, we don't charge. I think we would do it if people want. We don't have any authority to tell people how to do things. I mean, both of our organizations are coming from the perspective of groups that typically represent tenants. But how you run a commission, what it means to have, how you organize a meeting, those kind of questions, we can certainly help people with. And they don't have to follow our advice. I'm sure they can also talk to each other. I mean, there's another source of information is for municipalities to talk to towns that have had commissions for a long time and have worked out the ways that they do things. So if they'd rather not get their information from someone who works with tenants, they'd rather get the information from another town. It's out there. So what's behind your question is, are there ways for both municipal staff and for commission members, and for town attorneys for that matter, to understand kind of how it's normally done? Yes, there are resources, and we offer ourselves. We'll do it. If anybody asks us, we'll do it.
So the short answer is yes.
Yes.
You would offer it free of charge to a community.
Mhm.
I
Yes.
did support that bill last year because there was a huge issue in the senior rentals, and hopefully that will address some of the problems that occur there. But going back to this 125-year-old law, notwithstanding that, we heard testimony from the mayor of Wolcott and the comment he made pertaining to what some of the cities had paid a number of years ago when there was testimony. And it raised the question in my mind, is it fair to the taxpayers of a city to be spending in excess of $300,000 in taxes to store away the property? Because obviously transporting and storing the property, is that fair to the taxpayers?
Let me answer that question two ways. First of all, you really have no information in front of you that $300,000 is what it cost. And Mayor Dunn mentioned that he had heard that some municipality claimed to have that amount. And I think if you really want to do an analysis of costs, you should really get some more information from municipalities. Mayor Dunn referred to their cost as essentially minimal. I mean, they rent something for $100 or $200. So I think you need to do a lot more questioning if you want to do that. You also need to ask the question, what is the marginal cost? For example, as the Marshal pointed out, many towns store in their own warehouse. And now they don't have to do pickups, but they didn't hire people to do pickups in the day when they did pickups. And they don't hire new people to run the warehouse. They've already got a warehouse. And so you can cost allocate and say, well, you've got a certain amount of somebody's time and we're going to charge that for storing property. But the real question is, how much more do they spend than they would have spent if they weren't doing the pickup? If they're going to have the same employee anyway, they're not hiring a new staff person. I mean, that's a zero marginal cost. If you do that, I think you will discover that the costs are relatively small. Some towns contract things out and they will have a fixed cost, an actual out-of-pocket cost, because they're not using their own employees. And so those towns, it may be more. But when you're asking the question, what is fair? The first thing is, I would say, do not use $300,000. I don't think that's typical. And I think you're talking about a much smaller number. And in many cases, the number starts to approach zero. Maybe a couple $1,000s you're talking about per year, not per eviction, per year. The question on fairness goes really to the whole question of taxation and municipal responsibility. What is it fair that the municipality pays to send inspectors out to see if a private relationship between landlords and tenants is in compliance with municipal ordinances? And the landlord under landlord tenant law is required to comply with housing codes, and then separate from codes is required to properly maintain the property. Is it fair that the town hires inspectors to go out and see and respond to complaints? I would say, yes, it's fair. And it's fair because it's an important function of a town protecting the interests of its own residents to make sure that various laws are complied with. Somebody could say, private matter, That's not our problem. The tenant can sue if the tenant thinks that the landlord isn't complying with the law, why doesn't the tenant get a lawyer and sue them? It's an entirely private matter. It has nothing to do with us. And there is where I was trying to cite history. Somehow my citing the history, which was for the purpose of saying this isn't some new responsibility, some unfunded mandate that 4 years ago we put on towns. This has been always perceived of as one of the police functions of towns, just like having police departments. That was the point I was making. Somehow that's gotten turned around and saying I somehow have this commitment to never, because something happened 100 years ago, I still want to do it. That's really not what was behind it. But to answer your question about fairness, it seems to me that's how you would answer the question. You would say, well, what's the need? What's the relationship to the residents of the town and the needs for their protection for the municipality on the one hand versus what are the costs? And my suggestion to you is this is an area where it's really needed. It's the only piece of the eviction process that is specifically involves towns, not the whole process, the very end. And it's really important. And so, yes, I think it's fair. The costs are marginal, and it's just like all sorts of other things the towns do. It's ultimately in the interest of the town that they not have people living out of their cars or sitting on the street or not having a chair if they finally get a new apartment. Now, what are you going to do with people who've lost all of their possessions because they had no place to store them and no money to do it? The town has an interest in minimizing those losses because it may down the road have to help those people. What's fair? That's the balancing that you have to do. And so I would say the guidance of history on this is that this isn't a new issue, and we've struggled with it in the past as to how to balance that. And someone would say this is a landlord problem. The landlord should do everything. They should absorb all the costs. And I actually say no, from the perspective of a tenant. And ultimately, it's for different reasons. I mean, I say no because you need a neutral party. You do not want the tenant to have to find the landlord. Some landlords don't answer their mail. But from a landlord perspective, they don't want to be. They're not running a storage service if they can help it. Their interest is throwing this stuff out, and I don't blame them for that. But I don't want them to be in charge of everybody's last piece of property if you have an eviction, and you have a neutral person, you have a neutral entity. Okay, I'm sorry. You turned a switch on for me, and I apologize. I did not mean to go on so long.
I think the one thing that gets missed here is the fact that town staff has a job to do. And when they have to move items, that takes away from what core functions are. And I think that's what the mayor was alluding to when he talked about the cost. And to say that communities have storage, that question is not necessarily a very simple answer as to there could be a warehouse there for the town. Because I know most communities are at a premium for storage, and it raises the issue of storage units at the cost of, like in my community, over $200 a month. Just something to mull over there, and how that number can add up over a year's time. So there would be a cost to a community, and that conceivably could take away from opportunities for food and fuel banks and things of that nature. It's just something to consider there, and to try to weigh out the balance as to, yes, there is a cost, and yes, it can take away from other core services of a community. And I think that's what the Mayor Wolcott was leading to in his commentary there. So thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Representative Pavlik-Tomato.
Thank you. You've talked about so many things, but one of them, you've kind of gone back and forth when it came to tenants what they don't understand, but and what they don't know about the process. But it is true that tenants get free lawyers in evictions. Is that correct?
If tenants are income eligible and ask for a lawyer, they may or may not be able to get a free lawyer. In most cases, they would not get one. We have a program that was basically started in the past year, that was a right to counsel program. And in those, it has been implemented in about 15 zip codes. And in those zip codes, the tenant who requests would be able to get a lawyer for free. Legal services programs, which provide lawyers for free for people who are essentially indigent or very low income, has never been able to come even close to meeting the demand. And statistically, in eviction cases, prior to the right to counsel program, the tenants had lawyers in roughly 7% or so of eviction cases. Landlords had lawyers in roughly 80% of eviction cases. So you almost always
Well,
have
80% because 80% because a company cannot represent itself. Isn't that correct?
That's right. That's right. You're talking about like an LLC. I don't think they can represent themselves.
Correct. Correct. So the law doesn't allow it.
No, all I was saying was that most of the time you would have a landlord represented by an attorney and a tenant not. And so when you say tenants can, I just want to make clear, tenants in reality, even before the right to counsel program, certainly before the right to counsel program, in over 90% of the cases did not have a lawyer. And there's been a slight increase. There's been some increase in that in the zip codes where the program is operating. But you still, a lot of tenants never ask for a lawyer, so that you still have the overwhelming number of tenants in eviction cases are pro se. To say pro se in the sense of they function without a lawyer.
Right. So by choice, I mean, by choice or not by choice, in that they have the opportunity. You said it was by zip code, but there isn't a courthouse in every zip code. Courthouses are kind of like by regions almost. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yes.
So I'm not sure what you mean by zip code.
Courthouses are by judicial district, which is kind of region or sub-region, as the case may be.
Right. So when you say it's only in zip codes, as in when somebody reaches out to legal aid, though, then do you refer them to an attorney, or how does that work? Because I'm a little confused why.
The legal aid programs have attorneys. They're on staff, so they're paid. Their legal aid programs are nonprofits, so they're funded in various ways, but they do not charge clients. Clients are subject. It's a needs-based program, so that you have to have a sufficiently low income, or you won't be eligible. But the programs don't have the kind of funding that allows them to provide assistance to everybody who wants to have the assistance.
Sure.
And right now, for purposes of defending evictions, the primary focus is on the zip codes that are covered by the program. And the reason the program only covers certain zip codes is the program does not have enough funding to be able to provide lawyers across the board. I mean, not even close. The legal services programs do referral to pro bono if they can't provide a lawyer for somebody who asks and who's eligible. But the reality is there is almost no part of the private bar that will do pro bono representation of tenants in evictions. And the result is there's nobody to refer them to. It's not that we wouldn't refer them to somebody if we could find somebody. And there are a small number of lawyers in Connecticut who will take eviction cases for people who don't have the money to pay a lawyer, but it's a very small number, and it really barely makes a dent at all. So, and the way you check it out is you look at the data from judicial and see what percentage of the cases and what percentage of the cases do tenants have lawyers. And it is very low, very low. And you're right that there are some landlords who have to have a lawyer because they've basically.
I'd say most.
Well, if they're LLC, if they're business, if they're corporations or businesses, especially larger entities, they're going to have a lawyer because
but
they're a business.
any entity
If they're
has to
small
have a lawyer.
If there's a small landlord, many of them have decided for purposes of insulation from liability to organize their property as an LLC. And in making that choice and sort of incorporating, they do come into the rule that we say you can't practice law without a license, and you can't represent another entity. If it's a mom and pop representing themselves, they can do that. But if they've incorporated, they've moved themselves into a position where they will need a lawyer because of the rules that exist for not practicing law without a license. I mean, that could be changed. I mean, these are legislative decisions that could be changed, but the fact is, I guess what I'm saying is, for whatever reason, more landlords have lawyers. The reality is that if you go to court, you will see in almost all cases, there is a landlord with a lawyer and a tenant without a lawyer. For whatever, I mean, that's the way it is. I'm not.
Well, again, I can tell you
I'm not
because an
criticizing
LLC
him.
can't
I'm
represent
not
themselves, that's
criticizing landlords for
exactly
having
why
lawyers.
there's
That's
a lawyer there, because we don't allow them. So that's exactly why there's a lawyer there. There's an LLC, they have to, but let's move on. We're going to tenant landlord relationship. And, for many people, being a landlord is a profession. It's how they make their money. I'm going to guess you don't work for free, do you?
No, I'm on salary.
All right. So here, the many landlords, right? This is how they make their money. And like you said, a lot of small mom and pop, same thing. There was a great article, I think, in the New Haven Register about a woman actually being pushed out on the street, not the tenant, the landlord. So my question is, you went over for quite a while with a couple of the different representatives' questions about individuals not paying rent or not being able to pay rent in the situation. And hold on. And, I do foreclosure defense, and I've represented thousands. I've done thousands of foreclosure cases. So I know exactly what's involved, not only in landlord tenant, but also in the foreclosure situation. So I guess I'm a little confused when we're sitting here talking about, and I like the bill that Representative Wood and the committee has put together. I don't like a landlord who, if not taking care of the property, is ignoring. But when we're talking about a tenant not paying rent, I guess I'm a little confused in some of the explanations that you gave. If we're in this process of, let's say, a tenant not being able to pay rent, but doesn't that mean if the landlord has a mortgage to pay, that the landlord then can't pay the mortgage? Or let's say if this is a landlord's income, the landlord isn't able to pay their own bills. I mean, do you agree that that's a natural consequence of not paying a rent?
The landlord is entitled to expect the rent to be paid, and I assume that landlords need the payment of rent to pay their own bills, whether it's to pay the mortgage, to pay the taxes, to pay anything else. So I think the answer is yes. I would. It certainly makes sense that a landlord needs. I mean, the landlord needs to be paid. I'm not coming here and saying that tenants shouldn't be paying rent to their landlords. Of course they should.
Okay, it's just that you went into that several times as individuals not being able to pay rent. And I know there were representatives and other people, talking about individuals and the, different situations that people are in. But this, that same, I guess my issue here is that we're picking winners and losers, which I know a lot of people say, and I kind of am over that saying, but here I'm struggling with the fact that a lot of these bills, not only in this committee, but in others, are choosing, basically with the free lawyer, with paying to keep your stuff, with all these bills that we as taxpayers pay for, we're helping the tenant, but not helping the landlord. And so we are picking and choosing who's going to succeed in this situation. Landlord isn't receiving isn't receiving income. The landlord isn't being, they can't pay their own bills. And yet we have somebody who's free, we're storing their stuff for free. We are giving them a free attorney. We are doing all these things. And yet there's a bigger picture here of other people and other consequences that nobody seems to ever talk about. And so from the other end, for every situation and consequence, Rafi, that you've mentioned, I can assure you there's other consequences for those same actions as well. I'm a little confused. One of the earlier things that you said was that, and this I believe was in the chair's bill about landlords who are not taking care of the properties, that nobody has, or tenants and landlords, they want evictions pushed forward, or maybe you can clarify that. I was a little confused. Like there's no interest, neither have an interest in dragging out evictions, which I'm a little shocked at because we both know that's not true. If a tenant's not paying rent, and then it is in their interest to drag it out. And for a marshal, it's in the interest of a tenant to get evicted because they get hired. There's just, different people, different aspects and different perspectives that aren't being mentioned. So, that's why I kind of want, maybe you clarify some of the earlier things that you said. Maybe I missed.
Before we jump into that, can I just interject here that I'd like the discussion to be related to the bills that are in front of us.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting off topic here a little bit.
Sure.
But let's just keep the questions and comments related to the bills in front of us. Thank you.
There are two things that the representative said that I think maybe I could clarify on. One is when I talked about it not being in anybody's interest to drag things out, I was talking about fair rent commissions and not about the eviction process. The second thing is it's worth remembering that the procedures that we use for the last stage of an eviction, let's say the physical move out, are, I guess you could make them different, but they are under existing law the same as the procedures for move out in a foreclosure. So, and foreclosures, if we move us away from landlord tenant, when people are trying to kind of judge who's right, who's wrong, who's deserving, who's undeserving. If somebody loses, as many people did as a result of the pandemic, if somebody loses their house, they live in the house, they have a family, it's a 2,000 square foot house or whatever, it's filled with furniture. If they get foreclosed, they will be put out also, and they will be put out under the same circumstances that a renter gets put out if the landlord prevails in an eviction. And so when you talk about these processes, some people may have in mind someone who they think has very little property. Bear in mind, we're also talking about a house full of furniture and possessions that can be lost. It's also, when you're talking landlord-tenant law, evictions are not all about non-payment of rent or nuisance or anything like that. They're also about lapse of time, which means your lease is expired and I don't want to rent to you anymore and you've got to move. And we've seen that the number of lapse of time evictions has increased because landlords increasingly would rather not disclose the reason for the eviction. And you cannot attribute, in those circumstances, the landlord's not even alleging any fault on the part of the tenant. So kind of the notion that somehow you can decide who's right and who's wrong merely because the fact an eviction is occurring, you can't. I mean, you can do averages, you can say what's most likely, but it's not all of one or all of the other. And that's why we have a judicial process. And as I said, we don't have self-help evictions. So that's, all these, I understand all these things weigh in, but again, this bill We're talking about the bill. This bill is not dealing with the entirety of landlord-tenant law. It's dealing with the last stage of an eviction process that the tenant may or may not have been an active participant in, and now they're being physically removed.
So then I'll just end with this. You actually said, I wrote it down, while Mayor Dunn said 300,000. Well, Mayor Dunn said 300,000. Let me just finish, honey. While Mayor Dunn said 300,000, you said a couple hundred. To rent even a small space in a storage is about $100 and $150. You get 10, right? 10 evictions easily. We'll say in Bristol, 10 evictions a month for a year to store their stuff. That's $12,000. You really think that it's $200 to $300 to store things with only if only 10 tenants are evicted, right? And we all know it's more than 10 in a year, right? You're still going to stick with that $100 to $200 number. I'm a little shocked. You can do some pretty simple math. I mean, I don't know, Rafi, if you think that storing something is $10. I assure you it's not. Yeah, we're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, easily over $100,000, easily. I mean, I'm just with a pencil and a piece of paper doing some simple math here. So I am, how anybody could say it's a couple $100, how anybody can't realize that it ends up being thousands and thousands of dollars, which a bigger town, you have a little more wiggle room, right? But in a small town like Mayor Dunn's Woolpit, and we have a lot of small towns, let's face it. We all know that here. We have 169, right? There are many towns, okay? Many small towns where this is a lot of money, and it can add up. And they don't have to assume that a town has their own storage or, that's really just not the case. That's not the proper role of government. Government, their constitution says nowhere you have to store people's stuff. It doesn't say that anywhere, okay? And if we want to go historical, I'll do that all day. We can go back to the Constitution. We can look at the proper role of government, why government was set up, what government's role is. And I assure you, it's not to store people's things. And it's also not to get involved in private contracts. So I'm tired of these, of people saying things that just simply aren't true, okay? Because they're not involved in the day-to-day of what goes on in a town or in courts in many ways. I'm really frustrated at this point at some of the, what I feel are non-realities or fantasy numbers and situations, because again, like you said, Rafi, and I do appreciate, we're not looking at, other people who are affected by this. And I'm not saying it's an easy situation. Again, I do foreclosure defense, and I do a lot of them. And, I try to help as many people as I can. And I know you have the same role in your organization, and I appreciate that. But again, there's always a bigger picture here. And as a taxpayer, I get frustrated because it's okay that I don't have a retirement fund, right? I don't have the money to put in there. I don't know what I'm going to rely on in a few years, in several years, but it's okay that I'm paying for somebody to store their things. That's okay. So, let's talk about fair. I'll do that all day, but you're saying what's fair for one person is not, then, it's okay for somebody else not to have retirement and for somebody else not to have other things. Maybe let's encourage people not to buy iPhones, not to spend their money, in ways that we know it's not necessary, and to emphasize savings. I just think some of these other things that we could be doing rather than putting more taxpayer money where I don't think it should be spent would be more useful in the long term. So thank you for coming to testify today.
Thank you, Representative Pavlik-Tomato.
If I could just briefly say,
Please.
my understanding was that Mayor Dunn referred to there being 4 evictions per year. I may have misunderstood that 4 storages, and that in the housing committee, he testified to an estimate of they only keep the stuff for a month. That in fact, he was saying they only keep it for 2 weeks, that the cost, he was referring to $100 for the month. Today, I think he was saying something more like $250 or $300. So I would just point, obviously for big cities, there are different issues than small towns, but I was not making up numbers. I was trying to base it on things that at least I thought I heard him say. If I misunderstood what he said, then I apologize to the committee.
Thank you.
Representative Nuccio has her hand up online.
Representative Nuccio.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you. This has been interesting conversation. I'm kind of finding myself a little middle of the road here with this, in that I understand that this is a trying time for people. I understand that it's also very trying for the landlords. It's trying for the tenants and everything. And I don't even necessarily think that it's bad that we're storing people's property. I guess the issue that I have with it is this is an unfunded mandate on the towns. I don't want to sound crass, but I don't care how long it's been there. This adds up, especially when the environment changes in a rental situation, which is what we've seen post-COVID, and what we've seen, honestly, even coming up to COVID, evictions and stuff like that were really an issue. And it's not just the storage cost, which I think is what the mayor was trying to get to. It's not just the actual dollars and cents of the storage, but it's also the time that town employees are spending doing this. And then they are the ones who are put in the position of being the mediator. And as he said, trying to figure out how people can get their stuff, how they can't, when they can, if they're crying, what the deal, it's a position that they don't deserve to be put in. If this is something that I think is something that we're going to keep, then I think we should definitely look at structuring it along the same lines that we do with the free lawyers or the fair rent councils or any of those things, because municipal taxes are the most, they're the biggest pain point for people. Depending on the towns that you live in, there's so many pressures on the mill rate, and that's the one that hits you directly first and foremost before any other taxes, and it's the most volatile. So I don't think that this should be falling on a municipal to fund this. I think we should be looking for where this service belongs. And if it is in line with the free lawyers or the fair rent or any of those other things, then maybe we should have that go there, or the state should be funding this for the towns. It is a precarious position to put towns in. And I think we need to understand and review and respect that. And then I think we need to look for a way to get it off of the local taxpayers dole here and find the place where it needs to be. So it's been an interesting conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair. It was more just a statement than a question.
Yeah, and I certainly don't have an objection to the state paying the cost. I mean, that's not really an issue with this bill, but that's a whole separate question as to what municipal costs ought to be reimbursed by the state and to what extent various other broader forms of state subsidy to towns incorporate these kinds of costs or not. But again, I certainly would not oppose state payments to towns if that were to be the wish of the legislature.
Well, sir, I can tell you that the amount of money that towns get from overwide state subsidies of these small towns, I can tell you it's minimum. It's definitely not covering something like this. The small towns get pushed aside and overlooked all the time. So it's the small towns that I think that this is definitely where we're going to hear the most of complaint from. I just think that I think we should take towns out of it, take the town employees out of it, take the town having to be the people to store it out of it. And if the state is assuming responsibility for lawyers and fair rent and all this other stuff, then they should assume the responsibility for all of it. This is something you could even look at the fact that landlords get first and last month's rent or guarantee from the state with RAP programs and everything else. Then this should be put in, that cost should be put in with something like that. I just don't think it should be falling on the local taxpayers, and it shouldn't be hitting the local municipalities and their mill rates to cover private agreements between landlords and tenants. If the state is actively taking a role in these evictions, then the state should take the whole role in these evictions. So hopefully we can find some sort of compromise that will meet the needs of the people that are being affected by this on all sides.
Thank you, Rafi, for being with us today. We appreciate your testimony and coming out in the weather.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Kathy Flaherty.
Good morning, Representative Wood and all the members of Insurance and Real Estate Committee. My name is Kathy Flaherty. I'm the Executive Director of Connecticut Legal Rights Project. We are one of the state's legal aid programs, and among the work that we do is representing tenants and evictions. You may or may not have questions for me after the very long colloquies you had with the Marshal and with Rafi Podolsky, but I want to share with you my experience as being a legal aid lawyer over 25 years and talking to tenants who have been served with that summary process execution by a marshal. We call it an execution because it really kind of, in a way, is a death. It is saying you are going to be moved out of this property with as little as 24 hours notice. Your property will be removed and put in town storage. And if you do not retrieve it within 15 days, it can be auctioned off. I think this does apply only to a small minority of summary process actions, because a lot of times tenants leave long before it gets to the point where there is that summary process execution by the marshal. A lot of the work that we do as lawyers is trying to make it so that families can have a smooth transition from their current apartment to their next apartment. But as the marshal said, being evicted from an apartment should not mean that you lose everything you have. What I have always told people is anything that has any sentimental value to you, make sure you move out yourself. Any important papers or identifying documents, make sure you move those things out yourself. Anything that you don't want to risk getting lost, take with you. But I have talked to people who have gotten that execution and maintain they got no other papers. I can look up on the judicial website everything else where they got served, but they might not have understood what it meant. And this is the end of the line for them. Anybody who's defended somebody in a foreclosure should know that's moving out a whole house. I have seen towns come back year after year to propose these bills, but when they tend to do it is when either the foreclosure crisis, when towns had to move tons of people's whole houses into storage after foreclosures, or the eviction crisis we have now where a lot more people are getting evicted. I, like Rafi said, have no objection to the state providing an additional benefit to the towns to cover some of this cost. But there is a reason that Connecticut state law has been what it is in having people, the towns, have that responsibility for storage. They're not moving the things anymore. They're just storing the things for the 15 days. They used to have the public works people move. That got taken out. But this bill would actually be all of you agreeing to put the burden on landlords that they don't currently have. So that is, and we oppose the bill because it also will hurt tenants. Just want to put on the record, I am in favor of 6784 and Senate Bill 1113 about the fair rent commissions. I've given you written testimony on all three bills.
Kathy, thanks for testifying this morning. We appreciate your joining us, as well as submitting written testimony that I've read while we were all discussing here. Any questions from the committee? Great. Thank you, Kathy.
Sorry, Rep. Pavlak-Tomato just put her hand up.
Sorry, we do have one question for you, Representative Pavlak-Tomato.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat what you said about, because you're talking about somebody who does foreclosures, and since I've done thousands, what were you saying about that again?
I'm saying what I'm saying is that at the end of the foreclosure, if either the owner of the house or there were other adults in the house who were not named in the foreclosure, they are going to be subject to a summary process action. They're going to defend it, and if they have not moved themselves out, they will be subject to these same processes, which means they will benefit from having their stuff put in storage by the town for 15 days. It protects everyone. And I think one of the things is, as Rafi said, the Housing Committee heard a very similar bill the other day, didn't make the exact same change that this committee is proposing to make. But the people who are getting evicted, the people who are getting foreclosed are residents of a town. The person who was in the hospital during the whole time the eviction went on and had no ability to save their belongings, that person is someone that our office is familiar with. The whole process went through. that person is stuck in the hospital. They have literally lost everything they own.
Right. And so there are organizations like you as an organization, you can store their stuff, right? You can pay
No,
for
we
everything.
No, we
So
cannot.
but it's okay that I can do that, but you can't.
No, I pay taxes for a lot of things
You as an
that I don't agree
organization
with.
can.
There are people who have differences of opinion
Right.
and differences of political philosophy, but legislators over years and years and decades have considered these proposals and rejected them for a reason. I recognize that many of us have very different ideas of the role of government, but the reality is this Connecticut legislator has had the opportunity multiple times to consider changes to this process and hasn't passed it because the majority of the legislature decided this is not what we want to do.
Right. Well, but that's why we can bring the bill back and the legislature can decide to pass it. That's why we have this process. However, again, I still go back to the fact that everybody seems to think it's everybody else's responsibility for somebody else's things, but that person isn't responsible for their own things. And yes, there's always going to be different situations. Always people in a hospital. But then there's also people who aren't in a hospital and are not paying for whatever reason. I guess I'm still confused as to why I'm responsible for my own things. I do my own charity work, but then I also have to be responsible to pay somebody to store somebody else's things. I have to pay for their food. I have to pay for their housing. Now I have to pay to store their items. But again, it's okay that I don't have money for retirement. I don't have money, just for even my car payment. If I were to have a car payment, I can't even afford that anyway. So, and it's amazing that, again, I still have to be responsible. Everybody else is responsible except that person. Sometimes as adults, we do have to take responsibility for our own choices, our own actions. And I understand that even things that are out of our control, because everybody, let's face it, everybody, you, me, we've all had things thrown at us, whether it's health, family, whatever the situation, right? A lot of people's lives aren't easy. And yet we still have to move forward. But again, there's choices being made and decisions and laws being passed where, again, I'm paying for everybody else, but I can't even pay my own. And it's the situation with many landlords and towns. I mean, I just don't see why it's even better or it seems to be okay that we put it on the backs of a town and taxpayers, as if that's okay to take from one thing and put to another. I mean, if all the money that's being paid for storage, you don't think that money would go towards something else? I mean, it's just, it's shocking to me that, it's not okay that the state would pay for it either. Again, we're the taxpayers of the state. I mean, again, everything gets put, guess what, at the end of the day, on the backs of the middle class. And I'm kind of tired, representing the middle class and having us put in more hours and more hours just to pay more taxes. It's getting tiring because everything gets put on us. So that's all. But thank you for your testimony. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. We have a question from Senator Anwar.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Flaherty, for your testimony, and thank you for speaking out. I think I need to probe you a little bit more because I think there's a mindset that anybody who goes through a challenging situation financially, moving towards losing their apartment or space, a safe space, it is their fault that has led that to happen. So do you think that's accurate, that everybody who gets to the point, it is precisely their fault, and therefore everybody else should walk away from a collective responsibility? And do the people get better and be in a better place? I just want to understand, because you live in that space, you help the people in that space. Could you help us with this?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator Anwar. And I think you know what my answer will be. So I will put this on the record. No, I mean, not every eviction in Connecticut is what's called a fault-based eviction. People can get evicted simply because their lease is up. It's called lapse of time. Certain tenants are currently protected from being evicted for no good cause. But a lot of tenants aren't, which means simply because that private relationship between a landlord and tenant has broken down. I always explain it to tenants as like a no-fault divorce between a landlord and a tenant. And the system does not force people to stay in that landlord-tenant relationship if one of them wants out, especially the landlord. They're not going to force a landlord to continue to rent to someone who's not a protected tenant, which means at some point that tenant will have to leave. But what this bill would do, if you were to pass it, would be to ensure that people who do not have the resources to move their own stuff out prior to that summary process execution taking place, not only lose the roof over their head, but potentially lose all of their belongings. I like to think that we are better than that as a state, and that we care more for the people in our state than to do that. And so that's why I really urge you to not pass this bill.
Thank you. And Kathy, you've been doing this for a few years, quite a few years. And a conversation like this in our committee here, has it reached to a point to this level ever? And what has changed in your opinion? Is the collective consciousness of our state coming to the point that the total burden on the landlords and the towns have increased, that we have to have these serious conversations?
I'm still amazed that the Insurance and Real Estate Committee raised this bill. I mean, technically, I was like, why is it even in this committee? Because I always think of the insurance part, not so much the real estate part. But then I realized you do have the real estate thing. I really do believe that this bill properly belongs in the Housing Committee, and they raised one. And the towns do come back. And, you know, from the perspective of a Connecticut resident who has lived here my entire life, you know, solid member of the middle class, which means I'm paying the same taxes that all of you are paying. You know, I understand why the municipalities come, and especially if they're seeing, because it's their desire to push this bill that I think is kind of a permanent part of the CCM agenda, seems to come out more when there are more evictions, which is kind of understandable because that's when they're potentially having to store more things. But I would really encourage you, if there really were to be some kind of thing where you're changing the burden of who's paying for it or changing the process, that you should get some solid, up-to-date information from municipalities on what this is actually costing them now. Because using numbers from 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago is probably not accurate. Knowing what they are now would be really important. And if this, you know, but, you know, there are people who would not want to have anybody pay for it. So we're just gonna magically pretend that at the end of this eviction process, we're not only going to put people out on the street, but we're going to put all their belongings out on the curb. And there are places where that's the way the eviction process works. And I'm very glad not to be a legal aid lawyer in one of those places. And we don't need to be that way.
I think what may have happened in the during the pandemic, because of the federal protections, we did not have any evictions. And I think because of those protections gone, there is a sudden increase in the number of evictions, and the towns are feeling the pain and the responsibility for it. And perhaps that's the reason we are having this conversation. And my feeling is that maybe in 2 years' time, we will go back to the baseline eviction rate rather than the sudden increase that we have seen. Am I thinking right? Or
I think you're probably right. The only correction I would really make is there have always been evictions going on this entire pandemic, because they still permitted evictions for serious nuisance. And what we actually saw was a lot of landlords bringing claims against tenants for serious nuisance that legally wasn't serious nuisance, but was the only way they could move a case forward. So but I definitely think there was a pause on evictions. They didn't go away. And like, you're replacing the things that didn't take place over that period of time, plus all the stuff that would normally happen. So yes, I do think the numbers are probably temporarily elevated now, and at some point will level off. But what we've seen is that the numbers, this month were the highest I think they've ever been in all the time that, like, since 2017, when the Fair Housing Center really started tracking the numbers.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, my last question, as a homelessness prevention advocate, I believe that if we were to prevent homelessness, and this is just because I'm representing the state right now, right? And some people are representing communities and groups, and we are part of towns as well. So we represent towns in many ways. So we have wearing multiple hats. But if we were to look at from a state hat perspective, as soon as somebody becomes homeless, the cost to the state increases very significantly. And the impact on that individual getting back into a shelter, safe space, and subsequently be healthy and well takes a lot more from the state to be able to do. And the more barriers we create in that process, the more the taxpayer will pay. It's like the ratio is for every dollar spent in prevention, we make $10 to $13 of savings from the data. Could you reflect on this?
I think from an overall systems perspective, you're absolutely right. If we allow people to lose everything, then there will come a point where the other parts of the system will bear costs. So it's just a matter of which investments are you willing to make, and what things should you do. And whether that gets paid. There are issues, I was told to keep discussion on the bill, but there's a lot of, the way we tax things in the state, there are issues with all of that. And I think there are a lot of systemic changes a lot of us would like to see. But just in terms of this tiny bill, what this bill would do would actually not change the process, would just put the burden of paying for the process at this very end stage on the landlord. And that actually is really bad for landlords, and it's absolutely terrible for tenants. So I would encourage you to not do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to ask questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy. Thanks for joining us and shedding a lot of knowledge on this issue, and we appreciate your feedback. Next up, we have Brian O'Connor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator Cabrera, ranking members Pavlak D'Amato and Senator Wong. Just want to touch base. I wasn't planning on speaking to the evicted tenants' belongings just because Mayor Dunn had already provided that information. But I do want to point out that in 1998, I think it was, that municipality or commercial evictions were taken out of it as far as storage and the responsibilities for the cities and towns. So I think we have had movement since 1895. There's been a couple other changes since then. And also to speak to one of the previous speakers concerning the inspectors, that's actually the reason why those laws were put in place is for public health concerns. And I think when you look at this relationship, the contract relationship between tenants and landlords, for the most part, unless it's a hoarding situation, it's not a public health situation where a municipality has to intervene and participate. Fundamentally, principally, maybe some of the smaller towns is not as great of an expense, but for our urban areas, it is more of an expense. You do have, and it ebbs and flows, as was mentioned earlier, but I think it's just the principle that, again, it's a tenant landlord issue and why are municipalities involved. Now, you can look at the process as far as the marshals. I don't think we're looking to change that. I think that actually works. I think it's who's paying for the storage at the end. I know, it was mentioned with the state or the landlords, and maybe that's actually as far as public policy where it should be. so the towns can recoup some of the costs if we are ultimately the one who is storing the belongings. As far as the other bills that I want to speak to, 6784, we speak in support of that. The situations that have been brought to our attention, the recent articles in the Hartford Current, I think are abysmal. I think, our local code enforcement officers can only go so far, especially when you have a recalcitrant landlord who doesn't respond, doesn't make the repairs in a timely manner. And I think the recourse being able to file a complaint to the Attorney General's office will be very helpful. I think it actually provides the backbone that we need to enforce these code violations and to get the tenants in a more livable situation and in a better quality of life. I think, collecting the rents and having the receiver make the repairs or at least adjudicate some of those situations, I think will be extremely helpful. And I think actually it acts as a deterrent. I think the last thing, especially some of these larger entities, corporations, that they want to face because of the multitude of properties that they have probably in Connecticut and elsewhere, is to face the Attorney General and the weight of that office. So I think that's a real positive bill that we'd like you to support.
Brian,
And
I'm
then
sorry,
finally,
but your 3 minutes are up. Please summarize.
I will summarize. Finally, the Fair Rent Commission bill as drafted, we oppose, and we believe that a better course of action rather than going down to towns of 5,000 is to look at it at a regional basis and maybe create a Fair Rent Commission within a local COG that they are already participating in. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We have heard a lot of discussion on these topics, and we just appreciate your feedback and coming out and representing CCM on this. Do we have any questions from the committee? Great, we thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have David Schwartzer.
He's online, but I think he's having technical issues. He has to accept the invite to be promoted to a panelist.
David, please accept the invite and we will come back to you. Next up, we have Betsy Gara.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Betsy Gara. My husband is trying to get a shovel out of the door there, but my name is Betsy Gara. I'm Executive Director of the Connecticut Council of Small Towns. We represent approximately 118 smaller communities throughout Connecticut. And I'm here today to oppose Senate Bill 1113. Under this bill, 130 towns will be mandated to adopt an ordinance creating a fair rent commission without regard for whether it is necessary or the most cost-effective approach for addressing this. Creating a fair rent commission involves considerable costs. The town would have to, first of all, go through the ordinance adoption process, which involves legal fees, even if there is a model ordinance, which we do appreciate our partners sharing that ordinance with our municipalities, but it still involves legal costs and reviewing, determining how it coincides with existing local ordinances. It requires the town to publicly notice the ordinance, hold hearings, and so forth. So there are significant costs with that. But on top of this, the staffing a commission of this nature, which has to issue subpoenas, conduct investigations, and adjudicate on fair rent issues, can be extremely costly. And again, we're not sure that this is the most cost-effective approach for addressing this. Towns are often criticized that we don't do enough on a regional basis, that we're 169 separate municipalities, and that we need to do more to improve efficiencies. But this bill is an example of legislation and statutes on the books that mandates a town-by-town approach, regardless of whether there are other opportunities to regionalize this. The current law does allow towns to combine to do a fair rent commission, but it's very limited in nature. We did have one town, for example, South Windsor, approach the Connecticut Regional Council of Government, or the Capital Region, sorry, to determine whether or not they could work through the COG to do a fair rent commission. And they were advised that this was not permitted under the statute. And I think that's a lost opportunity because, again, this is an unfunded mandate on the municipalities. It doesn't provide any way to reduce the cost associated with creating and staffing a fair rent commission. And yet this is something that can be done more appropriately, either on a regional basis or on a statewide basis. So again, we are concerned with this bill and continue to oppose it. We also do support the bill that would allow for the evicted tenants' possessions to be stored by either the marshal or the landlord. Just a quick point, there have been several OLR reports on this over the years, and one reported that they had reviewed various state laws, and that overwhelmingly out of the 37 that they were able to research, those states left the requirement to store the evicted tenants' possessions with the landlord and not with the municipality. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Or any questions from the committee? Seeing none.
I'm sorry, I can't raise.
Representative
having a
Nuccio,
problem
please
with.
go ahead. Gotcha.
Thank you. Hi, Betsy, how are you?
Great, thank you, Representative.
So I am actually in agreement with you on this. I think this bill creating these boards down to 5,000 is going to pretty much mean you're going to have one in every single town, regardless of need or anything. And do we have any idea on the, you mentioned how costly it is for the municipalities to have to do something like this. Do you have any idea on what the average cost for creating something like this is in the municipality, regardless of size? Are they standard?
Well, one of the issues is that the law was just recently adopted to require that towns with a population of 25,000 or more create the Fair Rent Commission. So I think we're still getting a handle on the costs. I could certainly give you costs associated with just attorney's fees, which generally run between $300 and $500 an hour to review ordinances, develop ordinances. But we don't have a good handle on the costs associated with staffing those fair rent commissions. And I don't think you're going to have that until we've seen how many complaints they receive, what the requirements were for being able to make an adjudication of those complaints that are received. So I think we can look at some of the existing, and I do plan on reaching out because there are some smaller towns, even below the 25,000 population threshold, that have fair rent commissions. So I will get back to you on some specific costs associated with that.
I would appreciate that because I get a little frustrated when bills come forward and people say, no, this is too broad. And then we narrow it and say, okay, we're going to do it for 25,000 and above. And everybody says, okay, let's do that. We'll do that. We'll see how it goes for a few years and, see what kind of results we get. And then the very next year they put in a bill that says, nope, we're going to go back to the full bill that nobody wanted in the beginning. And, now we have to try to find a way to do this. It's like, we don't give stuff enough time to work and see whether or not it's effective. And I know in one of my towns, we have just a housing authority, and it's not by paid members. We have a lot of volunteers on that board, and we can't get volunteers because they get harassed by people, like personally harassed by people for doing this. So we can't have volunteers that do this. So you're gonna have to have paid staff. And when you have a town that's 3,000, 4,000 people, or even 10,000 people, you're going to have to staff this up. You're going to have the expense that goes along with it. I think we need to just slow the roll a little bit on Connecticut government, and let's see if what we already put in place yields what we want before we go back and force it down to what was originally denied in the original bill, right? So I would really appreciate that information, because the amount of stuff that we're throwing down to the municipalities now, one of the top conversations that we have in the state all the time is about diversity, but then you rely on local property taxes and the high mill rates for these small towns who don't have all these services and don't get money from the state, don't get millions and millions of dollars for grants and this and that. It just makes their mill rate go up, and you're never going to have diversity in these towns because you simply just can't afford to live there. So I'm very interested in the cost of what this would be, and just the logic behind saying that any town that size, up through that size, has to have this kind of commission. it doesn't seem like the best value for it for me. So I'd appreciate any information that you could get. If you could send it to the whole commission, I think that would be very useful.
Thank you, Representative. I agree with everything you say. And I have to say that our small towns are facing significant cost burdens right now. So we have to be very careful about imposing additional mandates on them at a time when they're facing, first of all, significant inflation costs. A lot of them are facing reductions in municipal aid under the proposed budget. We have 42 towns that are actually seeing a reduction of aid of over $100,000 in the proposed budget. At the same time, EMS costs providing emergency medical services are going through the roof. We have to be very careful about these mandated bills. And so I appreciate your concerns as well. And again, I will follow up with respect to the costs of creating and staffing a commission.
I appreciate that. Last count I had a few years ago was there were 384 unfunded mandates on towns. And then we passed legislation for one of them saying, we're going to give volunteer fire departments, we're going to pay them for calls that they have to respond to on the state highways. And then this year, the governor removes that funding 100% from the budget. So we pass it saying, yes, we recognize this is a burden. We're going to try to take some of that burden off of you. And then it goes away, right? So that's my frustration here is there's so much unfunded on the towns that the state is pushing down. And it's just, this is us as legislators. I'm a member of small towns, right? And we need to have a voice up here because just because it works in these cities doesn't mean it's going to work in the small towns, right? There has to be some sort of compromise. And I'm very, very cautious and very wary of what we're asking the towns to do. And then expecting them to have all these solutions to problems that they're never going to have because they don't get the assistance. So thank you, Betsy. I appreciate your testimony and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Garland, for testifying today.
Thank you, Senator.
Stay safe. Up next, we have Mr. David Schwartzer. Am I saying your name right, I hope?
Yes, good morning. Members of the committee, I come before you today in opposition of SB 1112 for reasons that are cited in my submitted written testimony. In lieu of SB 1112, I urge you to enact HB 5804 introduced by Representative Gary Turco. HB 5804 provides equitable solutions to address the ongoing issue of long-term care premium increases. First, based on the current language of Connecticut General Statute 38A-501, a long-term care carrier need only show that at some point in the future, their losses will exceed 60% of the collectible premium to qualify for a rate increase. HB 5804 changes 38A-501 to require that the loss ratio for Connecticut policies must currently be 60% before a long-term carrier is granted a rate increase. This one change would have eliminated 50% of the rate increases granted to Genworth Financial since 2010, and in my individual case, would have eliminated all of the rate increases approved to date. In addition, I asked that the 60% threshold be raised to 80%. I know of no other industry that is allowed to get a guaranteed profit of 40%. Next, in my data review, I found that 100% of the policy forms were closed to new business at the time that the rate increases were filed. Without having enough heterogeneous policyholders to support future claims, the law of large numbers, a basic premise of insurance, collapses. 5804 would require carriers to show that they sold enough policies with sufficient premiums to substantially cover the anticipated losses for each policy form. Absent that, their actions show that they never intended to have the premiums to cover these losses. Finally, in their 2016 annual report, Genworth announced that their plans were to, and I quote, separate and then isolate our long-term care business from our other U.S. life insurance businesses. This will allow any future dividends to be paid directly to the holding company and give a clearer picture of the necessity for long-term care insurance rate actions that we are working towards today, end quote. Genworth Financial presents financial information that is skewed completely in their favor. Meanwhile, by the end of 2021, at the parent organization, Genworth Financial reported a total revenue of almost $75 billion, with cash on hand of over $29 billion and total assets of $185 billion. HB 5804 would allow the Connecticut Insurance Department to examine the financial health at the highest levels of the company to better understand the true needs for rate increases. In conclusion, these changes are the substance of HB 5804. I believe these proposed changes are fair and reasonable. They allow the long-term care insurance carriers to continue to do business in Connecticut while bringing relief to the Connecticut policyholders, and I urge you to pass this important piece of legislation. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions from the committee? Great. David, we did read your testimony, which was very detailed, and thank you very much for sharing all that information with us. I know you've been helping the committee understand this issue over the years. Thank you. Next up, we have John Souza.
Oh, good morning, Chairperson Wood. John Souza. I volunteer as the president of the Connecticut Coalition of Property Owners, and I'm a full-time landlord in the Hartford area. The coalition has members all around the state, all the way from Enfield and Hartford, New Haven, Hartford, New Britain, Stamford. Our members own thousands of small units around the state, and mostly are small business people. They often have other jobs, and this is their part-time occupation of taking care of real estate. We know most of our tenants by their first names and value the relationship that benefits all. I'm going to speak about three things today. The first one was on my testimony, so briefly 6784, that's the receivership for non-compliant landlords. Our generally has never defended bad landlords, and I think we're going to stay with that. My only concern is that at some point that the government goes down where they decide to lower the amount of units that would be involved with. It's a constant problem with some of the laws that are passed around here. And again, as long as it goes back to the owner at some point, I think that's a pretty reasonable way to solve the problem. But they're having a Rocky Hill, and I guess there's some problems in New Haven as well. So I will offer some support for that. Second, I'm going to oppose as written the act about the evicted tenant's personal property. This bill has been around for years and years. It's been batted around. There's basically the landlords and the towns on one side, and the legal aid and our friends at the sheriff's department on the other. And it's expensive for everybody. And that's the main problem. Nobody wants to deal with it. It's static. I understand that. And everybody has some good points. So I'm going to offer a solution kind of middle of the road and hope save some money for everybody. And if we could take some money out of the cost of housing, that's a good thing, because it's getting more expensive for everybody. And we're trying to hold, the rate of increase in Connecticut on everything because it's an expensive place to be. And my thought was somehow make it optional that, it's not automatic that they would move everything out of the property. And because I've moved and I've left a lot of stuff behind, I get a dumpster and I throw it in, but tenants don't do that. When they leave, a lot of times if they're not there and the sheriff shows up, they've taken what they want and they leave the rest behind. Often, it's not all junk, but they just only take what they want. So if they had a way or a system to say, hey, I really just want the bed, the rest of it's junk, maybe the town can help them with that and keep everybody happy. And it would probably save 50 to 60% for myself and save 60 to 70% for the towns. So they don't have to handle it. I think that would be a pretty reasonable way of doing it. It's kind of a middle of the road. Believe me, if I had my way, of course, I wouldn't do that. I would just say it's abandoned property. But I understand both sides of it. So I'll add that point. And lastly, an act concerning the Fair Rent Commission. I heard Representative Nucio, I believe it's pronounced, spoke quite eloquently about it. We just rolled out this bill last year to include another 25 towns or so that have to have the Fair Rent Commissions. We supported or kind of supported the Fair Rent Commissions. We think that's the fairest way for landlords and tenants to resolve their differences, as long as the commissions are required to have balance. And that's kind of my main problem with some of the commissions that have existed for a long time. there's often no landlords on the commission. And these people are making decisions without, landlord participation.
John,
Um,
I'm
this
I'm
is a
sorry to interrupt. Your
problem.
3 minutes are up. Please summarize.
Thank you very much. So if they're going to make changes to the bill, I'd ask that they make it's in my testimony, but make it fair for everybody. And maybe wait a year or two again to let all the problems come shaken out before they change it, and we'll have to go change it one more time. So thank you, and I appreciate everybody working on this snowy day like myself. I go back out and finish snow and shovel.
John, thanks for your testimony. I just want to say your comments are well received. We will definitely take those into consideration. And regarding the non-compliant landlord, HB 6784, thank you and others in the apartment association for supporting this bill, because really most landlords are doing good work and are taking care of properties, and these few bad actors are really tainting the whole industry for you all. So I appreciate your support on that. Any questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Senator Huang has a question online.
Senator Wong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Souza, thank you very much for your advocacy and your testimony. But clarify for me, I'm reading your written testimony, and you cited that it's opposed as written 6785, an act concerning the evicted tenant personal property. I don't know if you heard our conversation and exchanges. It was very informative, but tell me why you're opposed to that bill as written. And you made some suggestions, and I'm just trying to figure out why your membership would be opposed to that bill.
So I understood that it takes the responsibility away from the town to store the stuff. So that means that the landlord is going to be responsible for it. So that would add to our costs. It also, I guess, part of the problem is that, like I heard from legal aid, there's a third person or a neutral party involved when it's town. Who's it going to be? So it's going to be the marshals, and a lot of tenants are going to feel like the marshals work for us, so they don't get a fair and square opportunity to move their stuff. Again, this bill has literally been around. I've heard different variations of it for 20 years, trying to solve the problem. And that's why I suggested that we kind of compromise on all sides and say they have to do it, fill out a piece of paperwork or show up and ask for some help. And the towns will have a lot less of it, but they'll still have to help the tenant move their stuff. And I still have to get rid of whatever they leave behind. So they're still expensive to me, either way. So I think they're kind of a middle of the road solution. I'm trying to be helpful.
So you're opposed to it from the standpoint that if this language changes the law, that you and your members think that you're on the hook for this. That be fair to say?
That was my understanding of it. Again, there's so many bills this year that I get kind of, discombobulated reading everything, but that was my understanding. If that's not correct, and if it leaves everybody the responsibility, then, okay, of course I'm actually okay with it. I will say that as a landlord, especially a small landlord, the last thing I want to do is move somebody's stuff out. If the person disappears, because it does happen, they either go to jail or maybe they're in the hospital, but I call all their next of kin, anybody I can find, their friends, to try and resolve the situation without me, having to put their stuff on the street. It's expensive for me. I don't want to do it, but if their family's around and the guy is sick, they can come and help the person, either pay the rent or, get his stuff out, and everybody wins. So there's no reason that you should have to put people's stuff out unless, there's always people that don't pay and you end up in a bad situation. That's too bad. But if we can reduce the cost for everybody, even 50%, that's a good first step, in my opinion.
What would be the solution that you would propose? I know you offer some language in regards to the storage in your testimony. Can you explain some of your recommendations on that?
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying, how would I change it? I would change it so the tenant would have to request the town to help them, in other words, because I'm sure you've heard in lots of testimony in the past, 50% or 80% of the stuff that goes to the town ends up the 50% of, the time when you show up at my places, they'll take some stuff, they leave the rest behind, but I'm going to guess, the people didn't want it because they didn't even bother to show up at the eviction to say, I want everything, please, whatever. They don't do that. The people that are truly needy should get some help from the town. I mean, that's what social services is all about. But let's cut the costs out for everybody. And if there's a question whether they want it or not, I assume they don't want it. So at that point, they should just be abandoned or should be junk. But if they want the help, the town can come and help them. At some point, you have to advocate for yourself. These people didn't pay rent for, say, 5 months, 6 months. They've had a full court process. And, at some point, they have to be advocate for themselves. I appreciate that legal aid's trying to help people, and that's good. But at some point, somebody has to do something for themselves,
No, I hear that, and there's some debates and conversations related to that. But let's just say this. What I'm also hearing from you in the statement earlier is the fact that all things being equal, you say the municipality should bear the burden of this.
Well, you're saying the burden. So just to make it clear, the sheriffs come, I pay to put the stuff to the town. So I have to pay the mover, I have to pay the sheriff, and then they deliver it to the town's storage yard or whatever storage facility. At that point, it becomes the town's responsibility. So I've already paid to pack it. I've already paid the guy to inventory it, and I've paid to move it out of the property. Traditionally, they would just put it on the street, but then a few years ago, they changed it where they would move to the town. So they've actually, at my expense, they moved it to the town. So that point is when it's the handout to the town, and the town has to even start. Now it's 2 weeks, or I think it's 15 days that they have to hold it. So in that 2 weeks, if a person wants it, they technically can go get it. They may have to pay a fee, but a lot of towns don't enforce that. So they can get it back, but a lot of times they don't even see anybody again. If they try to auction it, there was another bill, they had lots of testimony. They never have any luck. They don't make any money. It's not worth the hour to get $10, and it costs the town, $100 worth of employee labor to get to auction it. So 90% of the time, most of it ends up in the dump is the short answer. And I'm not saying that people don't come get stuff once in a while, which is why I say the town should help people, but by request. I don't think it's a bad idea to do it.
And do you see, as a result of COVID and the eviction moratorium, do you see the rate of eviction rising among your membership?
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that. There was a tremendous backup during COVID. A lot of people struggled. A lot of people got help from United CT, which was good, and then they maybe fell back into hard times again. So I have seen it pick up for sure. I think most small landlords are willing to work with their tenants, if they're willing to work with us. But at a certain point, there's no other system, where if somebody's not going to help you, we have to do something. We have bills to pay too, like every other business, and we have to bite the bullet and go through the eviction process. And remember, eviction doesn't mean you're automatically thrown on the street. You go into court, you meet with mediators basically, and there's often opportunities to get help from some kind of government organization. It's just a process, but there's no tribal council we can all go to and sit down and smoke a peace pipe and work something out. There's no other process. Landlords, we're pretty patient as small landlords. You'll find that most small landlords don't even start an eviction until they owe you 2 months rent, which is half the problem. They lose 2 months before they get a start, and then it takes another 3 months. So they end up losing 5 months of rent, and they're upset about it. So the whole system has its flaws, but it does work, and there's no other system. There's, at some point we have to have our property back so we can pay our bills and pay our taxes, like everything else. So I hope I answered your question. I kind of went a roundabout way there.
No, I appreciate you offering your perspective from a landlord's perspective, but you've also understated the complexity of a tenant-landlord relationship, private relationship, and then gets to a stage where you've got law enforcement as well as municipal input into this. So it's a very complicated and kind of circuitous interrelated relationship that we're trying to fetter out on this bill. And I just wanted to get clarity from you, and your opposition to 6785 is a basis that, if not the municipality, then you're concerned that
then
you and your members would be bearing the burden. Would that be correct,
Correct.
based on that written
That-
testimony, as I understand it?
that's correct. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, John. We'll take your comments of having a peace pipe added into the bill. So, all right, just kidding. In all seriousness, we have a question from Representative Pavlik Tomato.
Well, in addition to the peace pipe, maybe I would like to add, we keep going back to who's paying for it, and that keeps getting bounced around, whether it is landlords or town or the state. So I'm thinking I might just amend and a couple different ideas, whether it's to take the salaries of certain organizations. Those individuals could forego their salaries and we could pay for the storage with their salaries. Maybe certain areas, even certain legislators, they could forego their salary, and this potentially could pay for storage for a lot of people and a lot of individuals. But might I add, I think my other suggestion would be that there is a period of time where people are not paying rent. And this is something I emphasize to all my clients, except in the foreclosure context, that there are months, and no matter who says that this process of whether it's foreclosure or rent takes 30 days, it's not true. It takes months and months and months. And during that time, people are not paying rent. So it's what are they putting their money towards? And there is a mechanism right now where the landlord could file something to have the tenant's rent go into go to the clerk and go into a registry and be held for a period of time to determine, okay, whether they're going to stay or whether they still have to go. And it's not utilized by landlords. I did put in a separate bill to try to change that and address that, make it a little easier. But this is a great example of where rent could be put into a registry and be used to either store their stuff at the end. They could maybe get that money back, right? The money back to go for a down payment for another place, for a deposit, sorry. And or to pay for storage for their things. As legislators, we constantly put in bills and legislation to state, okay, we'll add this clause. They have to read this, right? And what, no matter what the context is, it ends up oftentimes where, whether it's tenants or other individuals, buyers of homes, they now have 10 sheets of paper to read. And I have to agree, although I don't think lack of knowledge, you don't necessarily have to be an expert to understand where it says you could be evicted from your home. You could lose your things. It's pretty clear. And the same people who say, oh, they don't understand, well, are the same ones who pushed for this legislation to have these extra clauses and information put on sheets of paper and handed to the individual. And now they're handed the information. They are then, they actually have these options, whether they get the help or not. Let's face it, tenants have legal aid and other resources that landlords do not. And even landlords that are struggling, right? As you say, Mr. Sousa, not every landlord is a big corporation or a big company. Sometimes they're a single member LLC or an individual mom and pop. And so putting the money in the registry could essentially pay for that. Because again, I agree with you, in life, there's organizations, there's people to help other people out. But at some point, when it comes to, so we're helping with you with food, with shelter, with medical care. But now we're responsible for paying to store your stuff. And I've been doing this long enough. I've been doing bankruptcy and foreclosure for long enough to see that I know what people spend their money on. And I assure you, it's iPhones, it's cable, it's a lot of other things, but the essential things that are needed. And it's getting frustrated when, hey, I've slept in my car. I didn't have cable. I didn't have a phone in law school. I put myself through. I had 2 jobs, put myself through. And yet these things are essential. And now storing their items it's essential. And yet as Rafi stated, if it's so cheap, then 150, 200 bucks, well, they can store their stuff, right? So
Right.
you think that's a viable option, Mr. Souza?
I'd be all for that. I mean, especially since they haven't paid rent in, like you said, 4 to 6 months, maybe. They should have a few dollars around, and I don't know what's the situation that people, what happens to somebody that they're so can't come up with some money or something like that at that point. I'm sure it happens once in a blue moon, but if the family, where's the family? Where's the church group? Somebody else has got to help these people. It's the last $150 isn't, I don't think it's the money. It's the problem is my point. I think it's they don't believe that it's going to happen. They believe that they can live where they are forever and not pay. I don't get it. So I agree 100% in that sense. The tenant should be responsible. Like it says in my thing, we've given away a lot of responsibility in our country to other people for the things that you cause for yourself a lot of times. Again, I'd like to see some changes in the law for everybody at least. So I think that's a fair way to go. And I appreciate all of you spending the time trying to figure this out, because it's been years they've been trying to make changes to this, and it needs to work a little bit for everybody. But at some point, we have to put the ultimate responsibility on the person that's who caused the problem. And that doesn't seem to be too popular a thing to do in our country anymore.
Yeah, well, then I think we'll then bring up now, of course, when I bring up I guess it's called the outlier. It's the outlier when Republicans use it, right? When liberals use it, it's not the outlier. So we'll take the hospital situation where they don't have any, they don't have a single person. And I'm sure it does happen, right? Not, I guess to some people it happens all the time. Everybody's in the hospital without any family or anything. But I mean, in that situation, where are these organizations? Where are these organizations to help these people? That's what I'm kind of confused about, because that's a perfect opportunity for these organizations to step up, to reach out to those people, because the landlord couldn't get a hold of them. And I don't know why it's the landlord's responsibility to have ESP to, with my clients, I always say, if you're going to go through hard times, then give me 10, 50 bucks a month. So I know you're around. So I know you didn't take off to a foreign country. And yet the landlord's supposed to know where somebody is, that they're in the hospital when they're not responding. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that different rules apply to different people. And I just don't think that's fair anymore. But, again, that's where I love charity organizations and I really support them. And again, that's a perfect opportunity for them to step up to the plate and to help somebody out. So I hope the organizations in this hearing and throughout the state really take that responsibility and help these people out in those situations and actively find, because they seem to think that it's easy to do as opposed to a landlord who can't get a hold of them. So thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Can I add one thing to that? So I thought about that when they said that today about the person in the hospital. I was like, well, they're going to be in the hospital for 3 months, because then they would know nothing. But then miraculously, they have 2 weeks, right? Once they pull the stuff out, they would have to get better and then say, where's my stuff? And they would say, oh, it's still the thing, but they have that 2-week window to go get it. So, you know what I mean? What's the chances of that happening? Where's the family? Like you said, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense in the long run. So again, I thank you all for trying to figure this out. It is a complicated thing. And let's try to get some of the costs out of housings one way or the other.
As attorneys and as attorneys, and I've done both sides in the past. Let's face it, nobody, I would say in maybe 0.01% of the cases have I ever seen. And again, I did a lot of this in South Florida, okay, not Connecticut. So for people who look up my bar number, I'm way more in South Florida, and nobody wakes up and all of a sudden they're moving their stuff out. It takes months, and they get many. It's they first get served. Service is another thing. Now, remember, service isn't free, right? Again, we have to pay, the landlord or the plaintiff has to pay for service. So you're paying for them to get served the notice of quit, paying for them to get served at the end, and then all the documents in between. They don't wake up one day and say, oh, my stuff is not going to be here tomorrow. Doesn't work that way. Okay. We're talking months. We're talking paper after paper after paper. And a lot of people ignore it, right? And probably not the best path to take. Don't ignore things. It's, what they're telling you, that your stuff is going to get thrown away. It's going to happen. And yet people ignore it all the time. And yeah, I feel bad, but again, they're not paying rent, so they have money to pay for storage, which they could do. Again, yeah, I understand everybody's situation is different, but again, that's what those charity organizations are for. So I'm looking forward to them working with these storage facilities and offering free storage. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, John, thank you for joining us today. Next up, we have Gary Pope.
Thank you.
Is Gary on?
Yep, I'm here. Hi, I'm calling on behalf of speaking about HB number 6784. I am all for it, considering that it is, I guess the best way to put it, it's a great policy to have for landlords. As for some background, I used to actually be a landlord, so I totally get it. I totally get what happens when you're a landlord, the stupid things you got to fix, the totally reasonable things you got to fix throughout the entire time you're dealing with all those things. For example, I had a tenant who several times complained that I had skunks on the property and I was doing nothing to fix it. Granted, every single time I visited the property, they literally had trash barrels tilted over and literally spilling underneath the house, so the skunks had a perfect place to live. Alongside having stink bugs in the place, I had to get exterminators out there many times, and they didn't do the simple things such as like remove the AC units during the winter so the bugs don't have a free way to get in. They once again, with the trash, they didn't clean up any of the trash. And for a mistake I made is I didn't go around the back to see all the trash in the back of the house, and I noticed that they had piles and piles of trash 3 feet high in the back of that patio, the porch and stuff like that. So I get it as a landlord. Some tenants suck, to put it frankly, and it is just rough sometimes when dealing with some folks as a landlord. But that is not the case with why I want to put this proposition in 6784. At the moment right now, I'm currently living at Concierge Apartments at 200 Rocky Hill. 200 Cold Springs Road in Rocky Hill. And the problem we're having there is absolutely ridiculous, to say the least, such as it's totally normal. The second that it hits like below like 20 degrees, you walk around and there's some sort of flood just going on that's dripping down from the building, and you have to drive your car underneath that area in order to access the driveways, parking spots and stuff like that. It's totally normal for there not to be hot water in the building. Last week we just had to deal with literally a full week of no hot water, and even after they reported saying, hey, the hot water's back on, I would check, I'd put on the water, and it'll be lukewarm for all about 30 seconds. It'll cut right back to cold water. And that happened for another day or two or so. And that's just hot water. There's also those security issues for a while with all the doors being unlocked. Anyone could just walk in and out. Those lights not being fixed for months at a time. So those totally entire areas of the entire property that would just pitch black at night. I didn't even know about this, but my wife just walked around the place the other day, and there are hallways that are totally pitch black with not even any emergency lights on. And when I mean pitch black, literally she had the camera running and it is pitch black in some hallways. I'm actually genuinely curious if there's some tenants that even live in those hallways. If they are, that is terrifying, because it is imagine an entire 50-foot stretch with no lights, period. You don't know what could happen in that area at all. So anyways, this whole HB 6784, the whole entire point of it is that it's supposed to state it so that if a landlord receives about 10 complaints, one thing I couldn't grasp, though, to be honest, is I couldn't grasp if it's 10 complaints of the same thing or 10 complaints, 10 different things throughout the entire time. To be totally fair to landlords, I can understand if it's like a 500 place establishment and 500 unit establishment, and if they get about 10 complaints of anything in a year.
Gary, I'm sorry to interrupt. Your 3 minutes are up. Please summarize.
I'm all for HB 6784. Landlords should have to have their pay removed from tenants shouldn't have to pay rent, or at least they should have to go to some sort of third party, and the landlord shouldn't get it if they are screwing up and not fixing problems in the property.
Gary, thank you for sharing your story with us today about your living situation. And I'm just so sorry to hear it. It's not normal for people to be living in situations where nothing ever gets fixed and, you know, it's unsafe and not healthy and all the other things that you referenced. So we're really sorry to hear. We do hope that this bill will help situations like yours. Any questions from the committee? Great. Thanks, Gary. Next up, we have Bobby Burial. Nope. Is Sean or Olivia on? Christopher Galino. Christopher Galino, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Wood, Senator Cabrera, and members of the committee. My name is Chris Galino, and I'm a staff attorney in the housing unit at Greater Hartford Legal Aid. I'm speaking today on behalf of Greater Hartford Legal Aid in my testimony in opposition to the passage of HB 6785. Which is an act concerning evicted tenants' personal property. As has been well covered today, the bill will allow municipalities to opt out of paying the costs associated with the storage of evicted tenants' belongings for 15 days. And in these scenarios, landlords will be required to pay the cost for storage for evicted tenants' possessions. By way of introduction, it's well documented that eviction has a disproportionate impact on Connecticut's most vulnerable residents. Studies show that women, people of color, and families with children are evicted at a far higher rate than other members of the community. The majority of eviction cases are filed in cities such as Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, New Britain, and Bridgeport, which are among the poorest municipalities in the state. Our staff at GHLA regularly meet with individuals who have been issued execution notices and are facing physical removal from their apartment as soon as the very next day. And I can represent that these tenants represent the most vulnerable of an already vulnerable population. Many tenants were unaware that an eviction case had been filed and have not had adequate time to make alternative living arrangements. Others suffer from physical or mental disabilities, are elderly, are caring for young children, and are thus facing far greater barriers to finding new housing than the average person. Still others are working hard to relocate, but don't have the networks in place, either don't have connections, don't have family, friends in the area that they might be able to stay with, are being stymied by the state's low apartment vacancy, are trying to move, but are having difficulties with an active eviction case on their record. But they're nonetheless trying, but have simply run out of time. Now, the execution stage of an eviction generally comes after a long and often contentious court proceeding. An eviction represents really a complete breakdown in the relationship between landlords and tenants. And anyone who's spent any time in housing court knows that both parties can feel the effects of this process very intimately. It is a very tense time. It is a very emotional time. And it wears people down. It's financially and emotionally expensive. And at the end can really engender bitterness between the two sides. Now, as neutral parties in this whole process, state marshals and municipalities play a vital role in maintaining order between landlords who are seeking to regain possession of an apartment, tenants who are facing imminent homelessness. The changes to the existing law that are proposed by House Bill 6785 will only compound the burdens that the parties that are involved in this process are facing. I've submitted written testimony that reflects my testimony today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Great, Christopher. Thank you so much for your comments. We did have a lot of discussion on this today and talk through a lot of this. I don't have any questions for you, but do we have any questions from the committee? We don't, but if we do have further questions, we'll definitely be reaching out to work with you on this. Thank you.
It's terrific. Thank you.
Last up, we have Stella Anochi.
Good morning, Representative Wood, Senator Cabrera, and members of the Insurance and Real Estate Committee. My name is Stella Anochi of Rocky Hill, and I'm speaking in support, just as my husband Gary Pope did, of bill number HB 6784. I'm an educator, and because of that, I love history and literature. And so I wanted to start with a quotation from President Roosevelt about when it comes to the country's responsibilities, like the country will not be a good place for any of us to live unless it's a good place for all of us to live. So when it comes to safe and habitable housing, it should be a right in the state of Connecticut, but it's not currently a right. It's a privilege of the few, and it's a privilege that my family don't have. When we sold our house a few months ago, we did so because my eldest son was recently diagnosed with autism. His previous school could not attend to his needs, and so we had to choose a different school district. Rocky Hill was the one. So we moved to concierge luxury apartments in Rocky Hill to just kind of settle the kids before the school year while we're trying to sell our house. But while I was led at concierge to believe that this would be an upgrade from home ownership, without the hassle of having to deal with a house our house was built in 1912, 1914, it's been a nightmare. And every day I wake up with now high blood pressure that I've developed, with like just praying, just try to get my family out of here. Since we moved in, we have not had consistent access to hot water, as Gary mentioned, the longest stretch being just last week when we lost hot water for 6 to 7 days. We've had to boil hot water on the stove. I've had to buy paint buckets from the hardware store so that the children have a place or tools to bathe. But when the hot water goes out suddenly, when they're getting ready for school, we don't have time to get them on the bus by boiling water. So we have these baby wipes and hand sanitizer to make sure that my kids are clean before they go to school. When we first came in and signed the lease, apartment 1 was not ready for us on move-in, so they had to move us to the second apartment. But this apartment, as I'm walking around with the representative from concierge, it was dirty, it wasn't painted, it wasn't clean. All of the kitchen drawers were broken, there's trash on the patio, and there's a big hole in the wall by the bathtub. The closet door by the front door was hanging off its track, and the stove wasn't working. The bathroom shower had no shower head in the master bathroom, and the bedroom carpet was stained. During our first week, my youngest son was sleeping, and as happens with children, their socks come off as they sleep. Don't know what the reason is, but unfortunately, his sock happened to fall against the electric baseboard heater, and it caught fire within minutes. When we spoke to the maintenance man, they replaced the electric baseboard, but he said that he couldn't explain why the temperature surged 90+ degrees Fahrenheit, despite it being set to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And to this day, my husband and I have noticed that even when we turn the electric baseboards off, they're still getting really high current that you can burn yourself with. So from August to December 30th, we ended up getting scalding hot water out of all of the cold water mains in the apartment, including the toilets. So much that there was intense pressure coming out of the toilet tank, so it would whine with the escaping steam from the heat. At concierge, pipes are so frequently bursting and leaking for days without repair that the leak that I recently found just this Saturday was going through several floors, and it's gone for so long that mushrooms are blooming on the edges of the carpet.
Stella, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt, but your 3 minutes are up. Please summarize.
My summary is that I'm paying $1,900 a month to live in a place that no one would voluntarily bring their children in, and I have no remedy other than to leave. If I leave, concierge can still just take a new tenant. So this bill will ensure that we don't just have a cycle of people and new victims coming in. We have actually a way to improve the substandard living conditions if we approve this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you for coming here and sharing your story. And that's exactly what the bill is meant to do. It's to repair these situations so that it's not this ongoing cycle of having people live in these kinds of conditions. We want to see these places comply with code, fix the mold issues, the leaking pipes, and all the things that you're dealing with every day. And we're just so sorry to hear that you're going through that. Are there any questions? Great. Thank you to you and your husband for coming on. That concludes our public hearing for the 28th of February. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Hearing is adjourned.